When the US unleashes the fire and fury of its modern arsenal in the Vietnam War, it's confident in its military might and the righteousness of its anti-communist cause. But it soon finds itself struggling with an underestimated enemy, a widening war, and political turmoil at home. North Vietnam, though, is also confident. They've been fighting for an independent and unified Vietnam for decades. The Americans and their allies are just the latest opponents in Ho Chi Minh's long struggle. As both sides clash in the jungles of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the Vietnam War becomes a quagmire in which military power alone cannot secure victory. In 1954, the First Indochina War between French colonial forces and Ho Chi Minh's communist revolutionaries comes to an end after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. In the following Geneva Accords, the US, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China agreed to divide Vietnam into two temporary states along the 17th parallel: the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the non-communist State of Vietnam in the south, led by former Emperor Bao Dai. The country is supposed to be reunified after elections that are planned for 1956. The deal is less than Ho Chi Minh hoped for. He fought for a single, unified Vietnamese state, but his Chinese and Soviet supporters pressure him into accepting compromise, since they want to prevent further US intervention in Asia. For France, the deal lets them end an unpopular war and quietly leave the region. So the Geneva Accords serve the major powers, but don't solve the fundamental concerns of Vietnamese nationalists. Although the US takes an active role in the talks, it publicly downplays its involvement as a mere interested nation. Washington is concerned about concessions to the communists, and it had militarily supported France during the Indochina War. Although the US decided against armed intervention at Dien Bien Phu, CIA pilots did fly supplies into the besieged French base. But now, with the French on their way out, President Eisenhower increases support to the state of Vietnam, free from European colonial overtones. Despite the planned elections, though, the US starts a nation-building program in the South. Washington supports the South for one major reason: fear of communist expansion. For the US, Ho Chi Minh is a puppet of Soviet communism. If Vietnam falls, Laos, Cambodia, India, Burma, Thailand, and the rest of Southeast Asia, and maybe even Australia, could follow like tumbling dominoes. As French administrators leave, the US identifies Bao Dai's prime minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, as the most viable alternative to Ho Chi Minh. Although Diem lacks charisma, he's anti-French, a Catholic nationalist, and fervently anti-communist. The US hopes that under their guidance, he can introduce democratic reforms and stop communism's spread. But not all American decision-makers are enthusiastic for Diem or the state of Vietnam. General Matthew Ridgway, former US commander in Korea and World War II, strongly opposes the US commitment. He worries the US will become bogged down in another ideological struggle in Asia, which firepower alone will not solve. Diem's democratic credentials aren't very reassuring either. In October 1955, Diem removes Bao Dai in a referendum, creating the Republic of Vietnam in the south. He supposedly wins 98.91% of the vote, raising some eyebrows in Washington. But his recent ability to suppress communists, as well as criminal syndicates and militant religious sects, leads to US approval. Around the same time, military advisors arrive with CIA representatives in tow. The US now pours resources into South Vietnam. In the late 1950s, the US provides $250 million a year. That's around $2.75 billion today. But little goes to building South Vietnam's economic base. 80% goes to the military, especially the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the ARVN. With these forces, Diem tightens his control. In 1956, he replaces traditional village chiefs with Saigon officials. Many village leaders are thought to harbor communist sympathies, but their removal leads to rural discontent. Re-education programs and slow land reform don't help matters. There's also a security clampdown. By 1958, Saigon has arrested 25,000 people and 90% of the Communist Party's most important members in the south. Diem's Decree 1059 outlaws most opposition and refuses to recognize communist resistance against the French. A Saigon newspaper carries his declaration. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party pursued communist objectives and sought to turn Vietnam into a colony and the Vietnamese into the slaves of red imperialism. They are communists, traitors, and agents of Russia and China. Diem's security forces, often minority Catholics, also target middle-class intellectuals and Buddhists, who they see as centers of political opposition. Diem makes it clear that he will not honor the 1956 unification referendum as promised by the Geneva Accords, because he claims that no free election can happen in the communist north. The US approves, but largely because they expect Ho Chi Minh to easily win. Instead, Eisenhower invites Diem to Washington to show support. Diem is an example for people everywhere who hate tyranny and love freedom. Meanwhile, in the north, frustration is building. Ho Chi Minh officially forbids southern communists from committing violence and instead concentrates on propaganda and building up the north. Estimates vary, but while enacting land reforms, northern government agents execute around 15,000 North Vietnamese as supposed evil landlords and subversive elements. Ho's commander-in-chief, General Pha Nguyen Gia, later admits the crimes. We made too many deviations and executed too many honest people. Worse still, torture came to be regarded as a normal practice during party reorganization. Ho now faces pressure to increase military activity in the south. Some southern communist groups are already ignoring his orders for non-violence, and military leaders are increasingly sidelining their own political leader. In 1959, the North officially supports a protracted armed struggle to overthrow the US Diem regime. They infiltrate thousands of fighters and weapons into the south via the Ho Chi Minh Trail in neighboring Laos and Cambodia. In 1960, Vietnamese nationalists formed the National Liberation Front. Initially a broad organization of communists and non-communists, it closely cooperates with the Communist People's Liberation Armed Forces. Collectively, they become known as the Viet Cong, a short form of the words Vietnamese Communist in Vietnamese. The name is used by Saigon newspapers to differentiate the southern insurgency groups from the northern regular People's Army of Vietnam. But practically, the Northern Communist Party controls both organizations. Despite this, most of the NLF's members are native southern Vietnamese re-infiltrated from the north. Despite their basic equipment, writer Le Ly Hayslip, who grew up in rural southern Vietnam, claims the Viet Cong had an important advantage over the urban and Catholic-dominated ARVN. In contrast to the ARVN, the Viet Cong were, for the most part, our neighbors. They did not insult us because they had been raised exactly like us. Where the Republicans came into a village overburdened with American equipment designed for a different war, the Viet Cong made do with what they had and seldom wasted their best ammunition, the goodwill of the people. As the Viet Cong expands, they step up their sabotage campaign. Edward Lansdale, a US intelligence officer and counterinsurgency pioneer, delivers a stark warning to Washington. ARVN in critical condition. Viet Cong have started to steal the country and expect to be done in 1961. Lansdale's solution is to provide more support to Diem. For others in the administration, faith in Diem is plummeting, but there's simply no one else to replace him. However, a new US president means a new Vietnam policy.
So help you God. So help me.
John F. Kennedy takes office in 1961 at a volatile time. Just before his inauguration, the Soviet Union announces it will support all groups fighting, quote, wars of national liberation. So Kennedy delivers a strong message during his inauguration.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
Kennedy develops a new flexible response doctrine where conventional and covert forces can be more widely used instead of just nuclear deterrence. His goal is not necessarily to defeat North Vietnam, but to ensure that South Vietnam can resist the growing insurgency and eventually take over its own security. He also brings a new team into the Oval Office, including his so-called wise men, advisors with backgrounds in the military and government, as well as business, finance, and academia. Perhaps the most influential among them is Robert McNamara. As a manager at the Ford Motor Company, his meticulous, data-driven management approach was praised with saving the company. Kennedy now asks McNamara to bring the same number crunching to national security as Secretary of Defense. Kennedy's wise men encourage him to send more military advisors to Vietnam. By 1962, there are 11,300 of them, more than 10 times as many as under Eisenhower. The Geneva Agreement forbids any state from sending military personnel to either Vietnamese government, so advisors operate on technicalities. Officially non-combat personnel, they received personal weapons when in Vietnam and can theoretically only act in self-defense. Some are training staff attached to the ARVN, others are special forces personnel that are technically civilian contractors. Throughout the 1960s, many also function as helicopter pilots ferrying ARVN troops. As their number grows, the US sets up camps and barracks across South Vietnam, especially helicopter bases. Although ARVN continues to do most of the fighting, often with surplus US World War II weapons, advisors join patrols and occasionally become casualties themselves. To manage this force, Kennedy establishes the Military Advisory Command Vietnam, or MACV. From 1962, MACV focuses on so-called strategic hamlets, specially fortified villages designed to keep out communist influence. The Americans entice locals into physically and ideologically secure villages with promises of material benefits and better services. By September 1962, 4.3 million villagers live in around 3,000 strategic hamlets. This, combined with counterinsurgency, covert patrols, and increased airstrikes against the Viet Cong, boost US optimism. But even with increased American firepower, the Viet Cong strike back. American helicopters become valuable targets, as US Lieutenant Colonel Archie Clapp recalls in 1962. The helicopter flight landed troops in their encircling positions. 8 of the 22 helicopters were hit at least once. Why, we wanted to know, were we subjected to this heavy opposition when we were landing on the heel of an airstrike? We concluded that it was not in spite of, but because of the airstrike. When the airstrike started, the VC grabbed their guns and headed out of town to the intended helicopter landing sites. In January 1963, the Viet Cong gained their most significant victory yet. Around 350 guerrillas defeat a much larger ARVN force at Ap Bac, including repelling flame-throwing armored personnel carriers and shooting down 5 helicopters. US advisors are surprised the Viet Cong stand their ground against air attacks, armored vehicles, and napalm. Meanwhile, despite their training, equipment, and support, the ARVN show poor leadership and little will to fight. There's more bad news for the US throughout 1963 as religious tensions spike in Saigon. South Vietnamese government forces under Diem's brother and sister-in-law continue to suppress Buddhists. Around 75% of South Vietnamese are nominally or culturally Buddhist, but the government pressures city populations, especially army officers, to convert to Catholicism, as Buddhist Jiao Duc recalls in spring 1963. There was tremendous pressure to become Catholic so you could get ahead, and we began hearing about a lot of secret conversions. I was incensed by what was going on, and I felt it was dangerous. The issue dramatically hits headlines on June 11th, when Buddhist monk Te Quang Duc burns himself to death on a busy Saigon intersection. After US protest, Diem promises to introduce reforms, but his forces continue to raid Buddhist pagodas. To the US, Diem's government is now on its last legs. In August 1963, the US learns of plans for a coup against Diem by army officers. Historians debate the level of US involvement, but they certainly don't prevent the coup. Instead, US officials inform the plotters that they support South Vietnam, not a specific leader. On November 1st, South Vietnamese generals depose the government. They execute Diem and his brother in the back of an armored personnel carrier, an act which was likely not planned. This concerns the US, but they hope that the military government will more aggressively take on the Viet Cong. Soon after, another surprise killing shocks the world. On November 22, 1963, President Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. By the time of his death, 16,000 advisors are in Vietnam and 100 have been killed. His vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, will now lead the war effort. Johnson always wanted to be president, but not a war president. His passion is domestic reforms he calls the Great Society. He sees Vietnam as a distraction in both time and resources from pressing issues at home. But 1964 is an election year, and Johnson's Republican rivals will take advantage of any apparent weakness against international communism. He later explains in his trademark colorful language. I knew that if we let communist aggression succeed in taking over South Vietnam, there would follow an endless national debate that would shatter my presidency. I knew that Harry Truman and Dean Acheson lost their effectiveness from the day that communists took over China. And I knew that all their problems taken together were chicken shit compared with what might happen if we lost Vietnam. So Johnson keeps Kennedy's advisors and largely follows their advice on Vietnam. Despite wanting to keep US involvement limited, he often agrees to their demands for further escalation. In December 1963, with the Strategic Hamlet program crumbling under corruption and poor management, McNamara predicts a South Vietnamese collapse in just 2 to 3 months. Johnson considers airstrikes or ground troops, but wants to put off the decision until after the coming election. Instead, he sends more advisors along with a new commander, General William Westmoreland, who prefers firepower and active operations to pacification and civilian programs. US covert actions are not new. They've been happening across Vietnam since 1961. But the US always maintains plausible deniability, like using Taiwanese pilots to parachute South Vietnamese groups into the north. By 1964, one such operation is Operational Plan 34 Alpha, or Op Plan 34A, which consists of commando raids along the North Vietnamese coast. Although the personnel may be South Vietnamese, Thai, Laotian, or Taiwanese, the raids are planned by MACV's Studies and Observations Group. This is a benign, bureaucratic name for the US Special Forces and Covert Command. The US Navy also carry out their own covert operations known as DeSoto patrols. The US destroyers with electronic surveillance equipment try to detect North Vietnamese communications and radar emissions. From a North Vietnamese perspective, the destroyers, which are supported by aircraft carriers, are likely motherships for the O-Plan raiders. This isn't true, but both O-Plan and DeSoto missions often take place in the same general area, and although technically separate, DeSoto patrols provide intelligence for the coastal raids. In July and August 1964, American destroyer USS Maddox operates around the Gulf of Tonkin on a DeSoto mission. What was planned to be an uneventful cruise would soon result in one of Vietnam's greatest controversies. On the night of July 30th and 31st, 1964, O-Plan patrol boats bombard coastal North Vietnamese military installations. On August 1st, the Maddox enters the area. Its cruise is designed to be unprovocative and remain outside North Vietnamese waters. But the Maddox is as close as 14 kilometers to the shore, which North Vietnam considers within their territory, unlike the US interpretation. The North Vietnamese Navy assumes the American destroyer is responsible for the previous night's bombardment. On August 2nd, 3 Vietnamese torpedo boats head for the Maddox. The destroyer fires warning shots and then targets the boats. The North Vietnamese launch their torpedoes, but they miss. During the battle, the Maddox fires around 265 3-inch shells, but scores only one single hit. This encounter increases tension among the inexperienced American crew. On August 4th, the Maddox re-enters the Gulf together with the destroyer USS Turner Joy. The night is moonless and the visibility is poor. The captains have been told to expect further attack and soon encounter unknown radar contacts. At 21:34 hours, the Maddox opens fire and the Turner Joy joins soon after. Sonar men on both ships report multiple enemy torpedoes in the water. Crewmen also report seeing their wakes and enemy ships. As both US ships fire, they claim they've damaged and sunk enemy vessels. By 22:30, the Maddox makes evasive maneuvers while the Turner Joy drops depth charges and attempts to ram an enemy. After 2 hours, the battle is over, but not because the radar contacts disappear. Commander Herbert Auger realizes the number of supposed contacts and torpedoes is reaching ridiculous proportions. He begins to wonder if the contacts are real and if the Maddox and Turner Joy have just fired over 300 shells at nothing. Nevertheless, reports of a North Vietnamese attack are already on their way to Washington. Only on August 5th, when no one finds any debris of the destroyed enemy ships, does Captain Erik on the Maddox send a skeptical report, but it's not a total denial that an attack took place. Captain Barnhart of the Turner Joy still insists that the attack happened. The Joint Chiefs of Staff urgently request information to give to the President. As messages flurry across the Pacific, both sides prioritize supposed torpedo and ship sightings. In the following days, both captains say that an attack did take place, although not as large as they thought. Meanwhile, McNamara relies heavily on intercepted North Vietnamese Navy messages, seemingly planning that attack. Johnson then orders retaliatory airstrikes at coastal bases in Vinh on August 5th. In the raid, North Vietnamese defenses shoot down 2 US planes and kill 1 pilot. On August 10th, Johnson signs the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, allowing further retaliation. It's not a declaration of war, but allows the president to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. The US Congress overwhelmingly passes the resolution, and during the discussions, members condemn the unprovoked nature of the attack in international waters. Johnson doesn't tell Congress about Oplan or De Soto. Instead, McNamara claims the Maddox was on a routine patrol for the area and would continue to do so.
The destroyer was carrying out a mission of patrol in those waters, in international waters. When it was attacked, it replied to the attack. It continued to carry out its mission today and will do so the remainder of this week. In the same waters, the President has asked that the destroyer force be doubled and that an air cap, a combat air patrol, be available at all times on call to it. And as I think you know, he's issued instructions that in the event of a further attack upon our vessels in international waters, we are to respond with the objective of destroying the attackers.
Following the crisis, Johnson's approval rating remains high, and in November, he wins a landslide election. Still, he promises to keep ground troops out of Vietnam. So what actually happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? There was certainly an attack on August 2nd, since North Vietnam confirmed it, but there was no attack on August 4th. Instead, the incident was likely the result of radar anomalies caused by weather, crew stress, miscommunication, and poor visibility. According to the Maddox logs, they identified 25 probable torpedoes during the second incident. But the North Vietnamese Navy only has 12 torpedo boats, 3 of which were damaged after the first attack, and each boat only carries 2 torpedoes. The destroyer's own frequent change in direction probably sounded like multiple incoming torpedoes to Maddox's sonarmen. If an attack did take place, the North Vietnamese would likely confirm it for propaganda value, but they deny it ever happened. McNamara's intercepted messages are probably poorly translated and refer to the recovery of ships damaged on August 2nd. Some historians have suggested that the US deliberately faked the attack as a provocation for war. This issue is still debated, but most historians conclude it's unlikely. It is possible some evidence was misrepresented, and Johnson knew the full details of the second incident by the time he went to Congress, but he'd already made public declarations about the attack and his intention to respond, even if in a limited way.
The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage. Yet our response for the present will be limited and fitting.
So Johnson has gotten a congressional resolution, but he's reluctant to use it. US planners draw up bombing lists for targets in North Vietnam, but they don't use them right away. Instead, US planes secretly bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. This changes in early 1965. On February 7th, Viet Cong troops attack American advisors at Camp Holloway, killing 8 Americans and destroying or damaging 25 aircraft. On February 10th, a northern bomb attack at yet another barracks kills 23 more, angering Johnson. "We have kept our gun over the mantel and our shells in the cupboard for a long time now. And what was the result? They're killing our boys while they sleep in the night." On February 24th, US aircraft attacked North Vietnamese targets between the 17th and 19th parallels. This soon develops into Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign designed to boost South Vietnamese morale and pressure North Vietnam into abandoning the Viet Cong. But although the US effort is primarily from the air, they need regular ground troops to protect US air bases, like the one at Da Nang. On March 8, 1965, 2 Marine battalions land to provide security. Their presence only provokes more Viet Cong attacks. Bombing also does little to stop Viet Cong activities. North Vietnam increases infiltrations, and regular army troops occasionally cross the 17th parallel. The Soviet Union and China, who've mostly stayed out of the war, now send anti-aircraft weapons to the north. Meanwhile, the southern government remains in turmoil. Since Diem's death, there have been 5 governments of ineffective military leaders. U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense William Bundy describes the latest ruling generals, Nguyen Van Thieu and Nguyen Cao Cuy, as absolutely the bottom of the barrel. Westmoreland also concludes the ARVN can't hold the line. If the goal is to save South Vietnam, more American troops are needed. By July, Westmoreland gets his boots on the ground. Johnson agrees to send 50,000 troops for offensive operations. So why did the US get further and further into the Vietnam conflict? The fear of communist expansion is perhaps the primary cause. South Vietnam was not democratic, but American leaders felt it needed to be a bulwark against communism. This is made crystal clear in a secret US memorandum in 1965. US objective in South Vietnam is not to help friend, but to contain China. There are other reasons as well. Abandoning a nation the US had publicly pledged to support would be a global humiliation, and a personal one for Johnson. With Kennedy's legacy looming large over his presidency, he felt compelled to follow his commitment, although some historians suggest Kennedy considered withdrawal before his assassination. The Americans also expect to win. Many in the administration feel communist success until 1965 is not due to their strength, but to US restraint and the weakness of France and South Vietnam. Now Johnson had removed the gun from the mantle. This would, or so they thought, soon change. There were also racial overtones to American attitudes. Many US commanders had little regard for the fighting ability of the Vietnamese. This was largely due to their disappointment with the ARVN, whose poor fighting quality some US commanders then expected from all Vietnamese. Meanwhile, Johnson's advisors, especially McNamara, placed great faith in the military superiority of US firepower and believed this power, combined with his analytical approach, could produce results with mathematical efficiency. There's little discussion about what to do if things go wrong. That is not to say that everyone in the administration is confident of success. Undersecretary of State George Ball consistently denies that victory is possible, while others understand the Viet Cong has a strength equal to, if not superior to, US firepower. In 1964, David Ness, the Deputy Chief of Mission in Saigon, tells Washington, "The Viet Cong represents a grassroots movement which is disciplined, ideologically dedicated, easily identifiable with the desires of the peasantry, and of course, ruthless." The American GIs arriving in Vietnam would soon find out just how ruthless the war would become. In 1965, tens of thousands of US troops are heading for war in Vietnam. Backed up by B-52 bombers, helicopters, and napalm, many expect the Viet Cong guerrillas to crumble in the face of unstoppable US firepower. Instead, in the jungles and swamps of Vietnam, the Americans discover combat is an exhausting slog in which casualties are high and they rarely get to fire first. In summer 1965, 50,000 US troops arrived in South Vietnam as part of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or MACV. The USA hopes American troops and air power will be enough to compel North Vietnam to abandon its support of the Viet Cong insurgency, working to undermine the South Vietnamese government. Still, the US approach will be gradual and mostly from the air. By late 1964, the US has already been secretly bombing North Vietnamese supply lines in neighboring Laos, and in 1965, North Vietnam is hit as part of Operation Rolling Thunder. Still, the US mostly hits secondary targets, not Hanoi, in order to force North Vietnam to negotiate an agreement beneficial to the South. In this sense, US President Lyndon B. Johnson is not aiming for traditional territorial or total victory, but the prevention of a North Vietnamese victory over his allies in the South. North Vietnam claims no negotiations can take place while foreign troops remain in South Vietnam. And so, it seems combat and not compromise will be the status quo in Vietnam. US General William Westmoreland needs to develop a strategy to push the North out of South Vietnam at a low cost for the US, politically and militarily. This is a challenge, since political considerations mean his ground war must be confined almost entirely to South Vietnam. Johnson rules out any kind of conventional invasion of North Vietnam, as it will likely provoke Chinese intervention, as it did during the Korean War. The president also forbids cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia, since he wants to limit ground operations. This, though, will make it harder for Westmoreland to isolate the battlefield. The American debate settles on two possible strategies in South Vietnam: conventional combat operations or counterinsurgency focused on small unit operations and the political pacification of the South Vietnamese public. Although the counterinsurgency approach has its supporters, Westmoreland believes it requires more troops and gives the Viet Cong the initiative. Instead, he hopes to make use of the US advantages in mobility and firepower in a strategy of annihilation. He plans to take the fight to the Viet Cong, eliminate them in large set-piece battles, and cause such heavy casualties that North Vietnam cannot maintain the insurgency. It's a rapid attritional strategy. To achieve their goals, US troops will not need to hold ground, but will carry out search and destroy operations at will.
This is going to be a methodical search, house by house, village by village, as we move north. This small group of huts here houses some of the Vietnamese families. We're looking mostly today for military-age men that may possibly be VC. So far, all we can see are women and children and old men.
It's a plan with an institutional shift in the Department of Defense. Under Secretary Robert McNamara, the DoD adopts new statistical and quantitative management methods borrowed from the world of business. Everything about the war is quantified to assess progress and identify when North Vietnam reaches the critical tipping point when it can no longer sustain the struggle. Analysts and officers count everything from bomb tonnage to tent pegs, but the most important metric is the body count of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong killed in US operations. Since the US won't judge progress by territory captured in the same way as many traditional wars, the body count will form the basis for analyzing success. The Pentagon therefore encourages US commanders to aim for higher kill and capture counts as a means of realizing Westmoreland's strategy. The American kill count strategy expands the original passive protective role of the US troops, since now they're to go on offensive patrols and take the fight to the Viet Cong, and they'll be doing it with new firepower. In an ideal search and destroy operation, US troops identify a Viet Cong formation via intelligence and reconnaissance, and then quickly insert ground troops to pin the enemy down. As the battle intensifies and draws in more enemy, the US troops call in airstrikes and artillery to decisively eliminate them. Similar operations had previously been carried out by the South Vietnamese Army, also known as ARVN, but American commanders felt they failed because South Vietnamese troops lacked fighting quality, as opposed to a problem with the actual tactics. To support their efforts, US forces received new tools, vehicles, and weapons. From 1964, US Army troops received the 5.56mm M16 rifle to replace the 7.62mm M14. The change will not always prove popular, but the US military claims the M16 is lighter, more controllable in automatic, and can be carried with more ammunition. All important features in jungle combat where ranges are shorter and resupply is harder. Coupled with the M60 machine gun and M79 Thumper grenade launchers, US platoons expect to bring heavy firepower against the more lightly armed Viet Cong. Perhaps the most important asset in a platoon is the radio, which can call in support from fire bases or from aircraft. With much of South Vietnam consisting of jungle-covered highlands or swampy deltas, ground transport is slow to impossible. Instead, a brown water navy of patrol boats and hovercrafts navigate the rivers, while a new generation of American military helicopters provide unprecedented mobility. In particular, the UH-1 Iroquois, or Huey, replaces the cumbersome Shawnee to become the iconic vehicle of the Vietnam War. Used for troop insertions, extractions, medical evacuations, resupply, and fire support, around a third of the 36 million helicopter sorties flown during the war are made by Hueys. US jet aircraft such as the F-4 Phantom and A-4 Skyhawk also arrived to provide rapid close air support, including with napalm and white phosphorus, while the multi-minigun equipped AC-47 Spooky gunship can provide overhead cover for hours at a time. US helicopters have an early impact on combat. During the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965, air assault troops inflict heavy casualties on North Vietnamese regulars entering from Cambodia. Although the NVA launched some close-range assaults at landing zones, US firepower pushes them back, including the first tactical use of B-52 bombers. Although most of the NVA escapes, the US 1st Air Cavalry Division claim a 10-to-1 kill ratio, seemingly confirming air assault tactics and Westmoreland's strategy. At first, the helicopters also have a psychological impact on North Vietnamese troops, as North Vietnamese soldier Nguyen Quang Sang remembers. When helicopters spotted us, we had to run for our lives. It was terrifying. Once, when a helicopter dropped down especially close, I even saw the face of the door gunner. That was the first time I ever saw an American. I'm still haunted by it in my nightmares. By the end of 1965, the US can claim to have prevented a South Vietnamese collapse and taken the fight to the enemy. But the Viet Cong also adapt and fight back. The mauling at Ia Drang encourages the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong to turn back to guerrilla tactics. This is partly due to practical considerations, but also a nuanced understanding of the US political situation. North Vietnamese General Secretary Le Duan recognizes US strength in Vietnam is undermined by a lack of political and public will back home. We can fight a protracted war, while the US can't. Although the US can immediately send 300 to 400,000 troops at once, why must the US do it step by step? Because of fear of protracted war, and even stronger opposition of the American people and the world's people. Instead, the Viet Cong will take the lead in the South and employ strategies which had worked against ARVN. In 1963, US General Frank Osmansky summarized Viet Cong tactics. VC non-explosive weapons include caltrops, spike traps, poison darts, and even enraged water buffaloes. In a sense, their physical endurance, patience, and ingenuity are also VC weapons, for they have been known to live in dark tunnels for weeks, to remain underwater for long periods by breathing through hollow reeds, and to lie in ambush for as long as 48 hours. Sniping, mines, and booby traps become the principal means of Viet Cong attack. They prioritize mines since they maim just as often as they kill, draining US resources and morale. The Viet Cong also become experts at launching well-planned ambushes, often targeting officers and radio men to prevent air support being called in. Most attacks are over in minutes. These tactics are aided by simplified logistics. A Viet Cong soldier carries as little as 5 kilograms of equipment in combat, compared to up to 40 for a US soldier. The North Vietnamese can also draw on local supplies from friendly or coerced villagers. Additionally, they can blend into the local civilian population and call on irregular supporters who can perform labor, set mines, or collect unexploded US ordnance for repurposing. Vast networks of tunnels, some even under US bases, allow for the VC to infiltrate and protect their personnel and equipment from US firepower. Parallel to the Viet Cong is the regular People's Army of Vietnam, also known as the North Vietnamese Army or NVA. Thanks to political regimentation, propaganda, and conscription, the NVA quickly expands with new Soviet and Chinese equipment. Soon, NVA units can claim to match US squad firepower with weapons like the AK-47 automatic rifle, RPD machine gun, and rocket-propelled grenades. The Viet Cong are sometimes armed with World War II-era weapons, but also receive newer equipment via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Soviet Union and China also provide protection against bombing, including engineering troops, anti-aircraft systems, and fighter jets like MiG-21s. North Vietnamese fighter ace Lu Hui Chau recalls one advantage he had over US pilots. Once I had shot down an F-4, I was no longer scared of any type of American aircraft. The psychological factor is very important in any battle. Part of my confidence came from knowing that if I had to bail out, I would be landing in my own country. The North Vietnamese approach is to attack only when the situation favors them. As a result, they often neutralize US technological advantages through patience and surprise. In fact, although helicopters dominate the news, the reality of combat in Vietnam is decidedly low tech. One reason for this is that helicopters are expensive and valuable targets for the Viet Cong. Once familiar with helicopters, the North Vietnamese become skilled at shooting them down or targeting them at vulnerable moments. Their loud rotors make surprise almost impossible, allowing for ambushes at landing zones with RPGs or heavy machine guns. When the troops leaped from the lead choppers, the entire tree line erupted with small arms fire. A machine gun opened up from the hillside north of the LZ, pouring lethal fire into the helicopters. The rounds went smashing into the plexiglass cockpits. One bird rolled over like a great wounded bull elephant, the rotor blades still whirring as they chopped into the earth. The US loses around 5,000 helicopters during the war, about half to enemy action. To reduce the risk, helicopters drop off US troops at more secure locations for long, sometimes multi-week patrols in the jungle, known to the GIs as humping the boonies. In these conditions, the Viet Cong are only one adversary for the Americans. Wildlife, mosquitoes, disease, exhaustion, and dehydration affect US troops too. With only 1% of patrols experiencing enemy contact, mines and booby traps are perhaps the biggest concern. They account for about a quarter of all casualties, as one 19-year-old US soldier reports. It's an absurd combination of certainty and uncertainty. The certainty that you're walking in minefields, walking past things day after day. The uncertainty of your every movement, of which way to shift your weight, of where to sit down. When there is contact, the Viet Cong almost always trigger the engagement, with a 1966 report suggesting the North Vietnamese initiate around 79% of attacks. They also become skilled at predicting air support response times and withdrawing before it arrives, or attacking so close that air support threatens US troops as well. By 1968, around 15 to 20% of US casualties are from friendly fire.
As you come into the village, you always get this sniper fire, it never fails. And we invariably take casualties once in a while. We return fire, by the time we get to the villages, these VC are gone. And it makes it very difficult and very frustrating for us.
US weapons also struggle in the jungle environment, especially the M16 rifle. A US study records 10.5 malfunctions per 1,000 rounds fired in 1965. Overall, the M16's lightweight materials are sensitive to variations in propellant and poor lubrication, and many US soldiers who arrive early on have no prior training with the M16 before getting to Vietnam. Eventually, the Pentagon introduces modifications like rust-resistant components, along with better maintenance and training. By 1968, the M16's malfunction rate declines to around 3.8 malfunctions per 1,000 rounds, with the most serious ejection failures reduced to 0.32. Still, its early reputation persists, especially amongst the Marines. The M60 machine gun also has its supporters and its detractors. When functioning, troops value its versatility and morale-building firepower, including when mounted on helicopters. But others note its reliability quickly declines through wear and tear, with few replacement parts available. Its high rate of fire also requires riflemen to carry heavy 7.62 ammunition and barrels. Overall, this mixture of combat stress, physical exhaustion, danger, and inability to fight back creates frustration among US soldiers. You go out on patrol maybe 20 times or more, and nothing, just nothing. Then, the 21st time, zap, 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 you get hit and Victor Charlie fades into the jungle before you can close with him. US troops in Vietnam are also under many additional stresses. Around a quarter are draftees, essentially conscripts, and their average age is only 19. Few of the American newcomers transfer to Vietnam as complete units, but instead they arrive as individuals or in small groups. High officer turnover and the fact few experienced troops stay beyond their contracted tour of duty means that combat experience is not retained and must be relearned. The stresses of combat, an elusive enemy, and peer pressure might partly explain, though not excuse, how cases of American violence against Vietnamese civilians become widespread. As the war continues, civilians suffer increasing violence, injury, and property destruction, both intentional and accidental, at the hands of US, ARVN, and Allied troops. Hostility, or at least ambivalence, from locals leads some US GIs to conclude that villagers support the Viet Cong. In many cases, this is true. Even a South Vietnamese government report estimates 5 of the 17 million residents of South Vietnam support the insurgency. This realization undermines US soldiers' belief in the war and promotes indifference to the plight of the locals. Marine officer Philip Caputo is one who lost hope. When we marched into the rice paddies, we carried, along with our packs and rifles, the implicit convictions that we were doing something altogether noble and good. We kept the packs and rifles, the convictions we lost. US reprisals against locals may result from anger at casualties, but also frustration at their inability to hit back at the VC. The State Department's Daniel Ellsberg joins a patrol in 1967 which destroys a civilian home. Their desire to burn the house was in part the result of frustration, and in part reflected the fact that they honestly didn't know what might work. South Vietnamese civilians also experienced violence from the Viet Cong. The escalation of the war in 1965 weakens support for the VC, so they resort to more coercion and political pressure to get recruits, supplies, and intelligence. Civilian contact with US or ARVN troops also results in political accusations and denunciations. Le Ly Hayslip, a South Vietnamese villager, is attacked by the Viet Cong when her loyalty was doubted. She concludes, "After a while, our fear of the Viet Cong was almost as strong as our fear of the Republicans. If the Republicans were like elephants trampling our village, the Viet Cong were like snakes who came at us in the night. At least you can see an elephant coming and get out of the way." The psychological impact and tactical reality on the ground mean that by 1967 the war is a stalemate. When US troops engage the enemy on their terms, they cause high casualties, but the nature of the fighting is taking its toll. North Vietnam is also carrying out a strategy of attrition, and arguably more successfully. But Westmoreland doesn't think that North Vietnam is winning. In public, at least, he emphasizes progress. By 1967, there are 485,600 US troops in Vietnam, although Westmoreland wants even more. Large-scale search and destroy operations in early 1967 seem to confirm Westmoreland's opinions. The US claims it kills 2,000 enemy insurgents in Operation Cedar Falls and Junction City, while Westmoreland states there are fewer than 242,000 Viet Cong fighters left in the country. The reality is not so clear-cut. MACV's figures are almost entirely wrong. By establishing body counts as the metric for success, US commanders inflate the figures, sometimes by double. Officers eager to show progress post high estimates or count civilian dead as Viet Cong, according to a blunt, unspoken rule. If it's dead and Vietnamese, it's VC. The focus on quantifiable data means concepts that aren't easily quantified, like morale, ideological support, and the opinions of locals, are sidelined in a sort of, if it can't be counted, it can't be important mentality. But this attitude ignores vital elements of warfare, especially counterinsurgency operations, and applies clumsy numerical values to complex socio-political issues. The US approach is also based on their estimations of North Vietnamese limits and capabilities. MACV consistently underestimates how North Vietnam can sustain high losses through its conceptualization of the conflict as a total people's war of revolutionary unification. The CIA, who are critical of the statistical methods, report as many as 600,000 enemy in South Vietnam in 1967, with 200,000 North Vietnamese entering draft age each year. Additionally, US bombing has not brought victory. Although Rolling Thunder destroys 59% of power stations and 75% of oil storage in North Vietnam, this has little impact on a majority agrarian society and unmechanized military. Bombing is also expensive and dangerous. More sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons mean for every dollar of damage caused by bombing in 1967, the US pays $9.50. Instead, US bombing and pursuit of the body count is having a negative impact elsewhere. Americans are less likely to support the war, and international opinion is also turning against the US. In Sweden, India, and Japan, many people are publicly lauding the North Vietnamese for their resistance. In late 1967, Westmoreland and Johnson embark on a public relations tour of the US to convince the people of their successes in Vietnam. Westmoreland tells the public, "The ranks of the Viet Cong are thinning. The end begins to come into view." The first months of 1968 will prove him disastrously wrong. After years of boots on the ground and bloody combat in Vietnam, US officials are publicly confident. The strategy of eliminating the Viet Cong is working. The North Vietnamese Communist forces are on their last legs, and victory is only a matter of time. Or so they say. But as 1968 and the traditional Lunar New Year festivities begin, US and South Vietnamese troops find themselves on the receiving end of a formidable North Vietnamese surprise attack, the Tet Offensive. At the end of 1967, the war in Vietnam is a stalemate. While the US uses patrols and firepower to seek out and destroy the enemy, the Viet Cong insurgency carry out attritional guerrilla operations in South Vietnam, often dictating where and when battles take place. The result is high casualties for both sides and no meaningful strategic breakthrough, although US Commander William Westmoreland sees it differently. In late 1967, he tours the US to tell the public his strategy is working, and the North Vietnamese are reaching breaking point. Although Westmoreland is overly optimistic, there are fractures in the North Vietnamese Communist government. Some leaders, since labeled doves, are concerned about the cost in lives and infrastructure and want Hanoi to negotiate. They clash with more influential hawks, like General Secretary of the Communist Party Le Duan, who want to intensify the war. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese founder Ho Chi Minh is becoming politically sidelined. He's been chronically ill since at least 1964 and has stepped down from many official duties. North Vietnamese colonel and future dissident Bui Tin suggests Ho's ill health prevents him from introducing democratic reforms, allowing the Politburo and Le Duan to take further control. By 1967, the Soviet Union replaces China as North Vietnam's main supplier of firearms and heavy weapons. However, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev favors diplomatic solutions to the conflict, giving the North Vietnamese doves a temporary boost. To counter this, Le Duan and his supporters arrest political opponents and journalists, often on conspiracy charges. With his power base secure, the Hawks prepare for a new major offensive which will see irregular and regular North Vietnamese units attacking cities and towns across South Vietnam during the Tet lunar holiday. North Vietnam hopes a surprise attack on urban centers and military bases will topple the Saigon government, destroy a major part of the US and South Vietnamese ARVN forces, and pressure the US to end its support for the South. Commanders understand the operation is risky, therefore the bulk of the fighting is assigned to the Viet Cong and not the more valuable regular North Vietnamese army, more commonly known as the NVA. From October 1967, military preparations begin when North Vietnamese troops harass US border positions, including the combat base at Khe Sanh. Westmoreland believes North Vietnam is preparing another Dien Bien Phu-style attack, but others have since suggested that instead of repeating 1954, the North Vietnamese aim to draw US and ARVN forces away from the major towns and cities, and indeed, the US relocates their troops. Although North Vietnamese forces suffer heavy losses, Westmoreland reinforces Khe Sanh and thins out defenses around Saigon and other cities. And so at the end of January 1968, both North and South Vietnamese prepare for the lunar holiday. Traditionally, this is a time of ceasefire across Vietnam, but this year Viet Cong and NVA troops infiltrate towns and cities, sometimes disguised as festival goers. Since it was common for farmers to enter cities with their produce during Tet, the presence of unknown individuals with cargo is not especially suspicious, at least to the Vietnamese. US Lieutenant Colonel John E. Barr later recalled, "I noted the unusual number of young men in civilian clothes, unusual in that most Vietnamese youths were either drafted by the ARVN or off in the hills with the Viet Cong. I was assured that it was customary for local farmers to come into Hue to celebrate the Tet holiday. I accepted this explanation, to my subsequent regret." US military intelligence does detect the movement of North Vietnamese units, but doesn't understand the scale of the coming offensive. In reality, around 84,000 troops are waiting for the signal to attack across the country. At midnight on January 30th, North Vietnam launches the first coordinated attacks. Within hours, 5 of the 6 major cities in South Vietnam, 36 of 44 provincial capitals, and 64 district capitals are under attack. Tuan Van Ban, a lieutenant in the Northern 320th Division, attacks a US Marine base near Cam Lo. Around midnight, we moved as close as possible to the American perimeter. First, we fired a flare. That was a signal to detonate the dynamite that blasted holes in the perimeter. Within seconds, we blew a bugle and whistles to signal our troops to advance. All 400 of us moved forward screaming, "Attack! Attack! Attack!" In Saigon, a group of around 20 Viet Cong sappers blow a hole in the US Embassy compound wall and attack the guards. Armed with automatic weapons and rocket launchers, they attempt to breach the main Chancellery building but fail. US diplomat Barry Sorthian calls Colonel George Jacobson, who lives in the embassy compound. George said that the VC sappers had penetrated his house and he could hear people downstairs. There was shooting outside on his side of the compound, shadowy figures floating around, and occasional bursts of gunfire. As far as he could tell, the embassy was still secure. He had a pistol, and after we hung up, he shot one of the sappers coming up the stairs. Jacobson kills the last Viet Cong sapper, ending the attack. Other VC attempts to enter the Saigon radio station and presidential palace also fail. After the initial shock, the US and ARVN troops quickly reorganize and stage an effective defense in most places. US commanders are impressed with ARVN, which stands its ground despite low American expectations. Within days, US and ARVN troops reversed most Viet Cong and NVA gains, although this is not the case everywhere. The old imperial capital of Hue boasts beautiful architecture and 19th century fortifications, but the city soon finds itself central to a much more modern war. Hue had seen little fighting until 1968, and almost considered itself a truce city near the north-south border at the 17th parallel. Divided by the Perfume River into a southeastern modern city and northwestern citadel, it was home to an airfield, large university, hospital, and government buildings. On January 30th, ARVN commander No Quang Truong receives word that an attack is likely. He puts his troops on high alert, but many are on leave for Tet. Still, he assumes the NVA lack the strength to attack the city. Little does he know, the NVA 4th, 5th, and 6th regiments, supported by the Viet Cong, are converging on Hue and have infiltrated sappers and assault troops. A North Vietnamese officer will later write, "The enemy knew nothing of our strategy. By the time our forces approached the city of Hue, the enemy still had not taken any specific defensive measures." Their job is to open the city gates and quickly capture around 200 targets, the most important of which are the Mang Ka ARVN headquarters, Tay Loc airfield, Mac V compound, landing craft utility loading ramp, radio station, hospital, and provincial headquarters. At 2:33 a.m. on January 31st, a flare marks the start of the attack. NVA sappers in ARVN uniforms kill guards and led around 7,500 troops into Hue. Immediately, ARVN soldiers in the citadel put up improvised defense, especially the Black Panther Rangers. There's heavy fighting across the area, but the ARVN hold the Mang Ka and contest the airfield. In the modern city, the small garrison at the Mac V compound and nearby LCU loading ramp hold out, but by daybreak, the NVA controls around 60% of Hue. ARVN commanders desperately call for reinforcements as the full scale of the attack becomes apparent. Some airborne troops arrive at Mang Ka, but ground relief columns are badly mauled by NVA troops on the citadel walls. Marines from Task Force X-Ray are also on their way to the city, including battalions from the 1st and 5th Marine Regiments. But as they approach the modern city, the North Vietnamese ambush them. Enemy soldiers dug in close by on either side of the road, behind walls and inside buildings and on rooftops, let loose a withering fusillade that struck against the sleepy convoy with the force of a sledgehammer crushing a cockroach. Automatic weapons, small arms, rockets, recoilless rifles, mortars, grenades. Everything all at once. The US column needs the help of M48 tanks to push through the 8 or 9 blocks to the MACV compound at around 3:15 p.m. Commanders immediately task the Marines with crossing the Perfume River to relieve the Arvin in the citadel, but the bridge is too weak for the tanks and there's little fire support. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Gravel puts it this way: "We proceeded to the MACV compound, then were gifted with the most stupid, idiotic mission. 2 American platoons make it across but come under heavy fire from the citadel walls. Realizing the attack is useless, Gravel orders a withdrawal using commandeered vehicles to evacuate the wounded. Around a third of a Marine company is killed or wounded in the failed attack. It now becomes clear the Arvin and US forces are surrounded by mostly regular NVA troops determined to hold their ground, and the NVA is already preparing to create a provisional government in Hue. For the US troops, it will be a battle from the inside out." The Marines' first objectives are the modern city's provincial headquarters and prison, about 6 blocks from the compound. To get there, they will also need to fight through the university and hospital. But the first attempts stall, less than 1 block from the compound. Meanwhile, the Arvin continues to contest the citadel and eventually retakes the airfield, allowing for some resupply. The LCU loading ramp also allows for supplies and reinforcements to be brought in by river. Otherwise, Marine convoys known as Rough Riders run the gauntlet of NVA fire as they enter the city. The fighting now turns into a street-by-street, house-by-house melee. The Marines' area of operations is around 11 blocks by 8 blocks wide. Not a huge area, but a complex one to fight through. Commanders lack correctly scaled maps, while rules of engagement and poor weather prevent air support. Marine William Earhart recalls, "We had no experience at this kind of fighting, and the on-the-job training cost us heavily. A great many civilians must have died in the fighting. If you saw or heard, or thought you saw or heard, movement in the house next door, you didn't stop to knock, you just tossed in a grenade." Both sides quickly find rockets to be useful weapons, especially to blow open walls and gain new points of entry. Lieutenant Colonel Ernie Cheatham recalled a 2-hour firefight fought almost purely with rockets at a range of just 50 meters. Hundreds and hundreds of rockets going out, and the same thing coming back at us, but we had more ammunition than they had. Tanks are of limited use except for as cover on the ruined city streets. When used offensively, they rush forward, fire a few rounds, and retreat before the inevitable onslaught of North Vietnamese B-40 rockets. US troops find the 106mm recoilless rifle effective for demolitions and urban fighting, especially when mounted on the M50 Ontos light anti-tank vehicle. By February 4th, the Marines are making progress, having captured the university and public health building. In the attack on the Treasury, the Marines use tear gas, which proves effective since many NVA troops don't have gas masks. Once the Treasury is cleared, the aim is to attack towards the hospital, prison, and provincial headquarters. Using tear gas, 105mm howitzers, mortars, and recoilless rifles, Marines push the NVA out of the hospital and prison in intense fighting. Meanwhile, another Marine attack targets the stadium to the east of the MACV compound. Already, the NVA commander is thinning his forces for potential withdrawal. The US attack now focuses on the provincial headquarters. Using their newly learned tactics, Marines assault the building on February 6th, again using tear gas in a room-to-room struggle. Some defenders slip away, and by the end of the day, the Americans raise the US flag over the headquarters. Although they soon remove it due to regulations that it must always be flown with an accompanying South Vietnamese flag. The provincial headquarters was initially a symbolic target for the Marines, but it proves much more important. It was the headquarters of the 4th NVA Regiment, which now begins to collapse. By February 7th, resistance in the modern city is fading, but the battle is still raging in the citadel. The Arvin made some early progress in the citadel, clearing out much of the northwestern corner of the old city and south of the Mang Kha. But on February 6-7th, the NVA counterattack, using grappling hooks to scale the southwestern wall and forcing Arvin troops back to the airfield. Meanwhile, outside the city walls to the west, the US 1st Cavalry Air Mobile Division is struggling. With the help of helicopter gunships, artillery, and reinforcements from the now helicopter-borne 101st Airborne Division, they clash with NVA forces in outskirt villages and only tentatively cut North Vietnamese logistical routes. From February 10th, reinforcements from the 5th Marines are heli-lifted into the citadel. On the 13th, they expect to launch an attack from ARVN airborne positions to their south, but before they even arrive, they come under heavy NVA attack. Within 15 minutes, all hell broke loose. There was no airborne unit in the area, and Company A was up to their armpits in NVA. The NVA, having tunneled into the citadel walls, stopped the attack 75 meters behind its start line. The next morning, the Marines try again with massive supporting fire, including from offshore ships. Their target is the Dong Ba Tower, one of the citadel's fortified gates. But the flat trajectory of the naval gunfire mostly harmlessly hits the exterior walls. The Marines bog down after just 100 meters, pinned down by fire from both the palace and the outer citadel walls. On February 15th, more US reinforcements arrive, as well as permission to fire into the palace and the surrounding area. American shells partly collapse the tower, and US troops push through ruined walls and shattered fortifications. The Marines finally capture Dong Ba after a 6-hour firefight. Meanwhile, the ARVN Airborne and Marines attack the palace itself, but struggle to take ground. Once again, they use tear gas and heavy fire support to pummel the NVA defenders. On February 22nd, the fighting enters the heart of the citadel as the ARVN push towards the southern wall. By this point, the 1st Cavalry have been able to fully cut NVA supply lines, blocking the infiltration and exfiltration of fighters. The most significant development, though, is a shift in tactics. Both US and ARVN Marines launch night attacks towards the last remaining NVA positions, shaking up the established schedule of combat. With some NVA troops sleeping away from frontline positions, many are taken by surprise and captured. Aided by better weather and air support, the Marines and ARVN clear the palace and reach the southern wall on February 24th, raising their flags on Hue's flag tower. Except for mopping up, the battle is over. The Hue battle costs around 200 US killed in action, mostly Marines, and around 1,600 wounded. ARVN casualties are about 450 killed and missing and 2,100 wounded. Gauging North Vietnamese casualties is difficult, but estimates suggest between 2,500 to 5,000 killed with an unknown number of wounded. 80% of buildings in the city are damaged, and of a population of 140,000, around 116,000 are homeless. Civilian deaths are likely between 1,000 and 5,800 killed or missing. The Americans also accuse the NVA of targeted political killings in the city, with at least 3,000 bodies uncovered from hastily dug graves. The North Vietnamese government argues these are civilians killed in the fighting, often by US firepower, but this is widely disputed. With the Battle of Hue over, one of the toughest struggles of the Tet Offensive comes to an end. The NVA and VC are unable to hold any of their gains or trigger an uprising, but the Tet Offensive still becomes seen as a US defeat. Westmoreland is eager to present the offensive as the final gamble of a near-defeated enemy. He describes the damage and around 3,400 US and ARVN dead by March as superficial, and claims the North Vietnamese suffer 58,000 killed. Others disagree. The fact North Vietnam was able to launch such a sophisticated offensive at all indicates the US strategy in Vietnam is failing. Far from being close to defeat, North Vietnam delivers a shocking blow and regains the initiative. In a secret memo, General Harold K. Johnson writes, "We suffered a loss. There can be no doubt about it." The offensive also undermines the Johnson administration. They had been preparing both the public and media for imminent success, and yet the Tet Offensive shows the war is far from over. Photographs of the summary execution of a Viet Cong fighter by the South Vietnamese Chief of Police on the streets of Saigon lead to further questions about the regime that US troops are fighting and dying for. US public opposition to the war had been growing before Tet, but was by no means the majority, and pro-war counter-protests were common. But after Tet, protests go beyond the usual anti-war, student or counterculture groups to include mothers, middle-class professionals, religious groups, and Vietnam veterans themselves. By February 1968, half of Americans now believe intervention was a mistake. Johnson's advisors, his so-called wise men, also turned against the war. Despite encouraging escalation as recently as November 1967, they now overwhelmingly call for disengagement and negotiations. McGeorge Bundy said to the president, "Look, this thing is hopeless. You'd better begin to de-escalate and get out." And this was the first time the president ever heard anything of this kind. He could barely believe his ears. I think he was very shocked. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the mastermind of US strategy in Vietnam, has already reached this point. Throughout 1967, he becomes privately skeptical of the US intervention, often in opposition to the other wise men. In November, he announces his resignation, effective in late February 1968. His successor, Clifford Clark, soon concurs with McNamara's assessment on Vietnam. The result is a crisis of leadership in Washington. Westmoreland requests an additional 206,000 troops for Vietnam. Johnson refuses, but the request is leaked to the media, causing an uproar. Instead, with pressure mounting, Johnson changes course. On March 31, 1968, Johnson announces he will limit the bombing of North Vietnam started in 1965 and open negotiations with the northern government. He then makes another dramatic announcement.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
In reality, Johnson knows his legacy is in ruins. He's already lost a Democratic Party primary, and the war costs $2 billion a month, around $17 billion today. This leaves little time or resources for his beloved domestic reforms, and he is frank with his advisors. "I don't give a damn about the election. I'll be happy to keep doing what is right and lose the election. I will have overwhelming disapproval in the polls. I will go down the drain." The North announces it is receptive to talks, but makes it clear they want to negotiate from a position of strength, as the victor of the Tet Offensive. But who really won the Tet Offensive on the ground? And why, if the US caused higher casualties and denied North Vietnamese gains, is the battle often viewed as a US defeat? In reality, the Tet Offensive is a disappointment for Hanoi. It shows the cities of South Vietnam are no closer to adopting the revolution, and there are no mass defections from ARVN. The offensive also decimates the Viet Cong. It suffers huge losses and exposes many of its secret agents. It also shows the Viet Cong, while skilled at ambushes and guerrilla fighting, are ineffective in urban operations or at holding ground. Some historians even suggest the Tet Offensive was deliberately devised to reduce the influence of the southern insurgency and bring it under tighter North Vietnamese control, although there is little solid evidence for this theory. But in other ways, Tet is an unintended northern success, since it creates political shockwaves in the US and lowers public support. The US public is not prepared for how intense the Vietnam War has become. Instead, Johnson has actively attempted to insulate them from the conflict. Although not a concrete objective of the Tet Offensive, North Vietnamese strategists do recognize public will as a US strategic vulnerability, one they don't suffer from themselves. The Tet Offensive may be a US victory in the so-called kinetic battle space, but weakening the US administration's credibility at home and abroad is a defeat in the idea battle space. The US media, which had until this point largely supported or believed government statements on Vietnam, now becomes more critical. Veteran news anchor Walter Cronkite speaks for many when he asks, "What the hell is going on? I thought we were winning the war." Meanwhile, North Vietnamese ideologists weave Tet losses into the long-standing methodology of revolution. State control, propaganda, and personal experience has long since conditioned the North Vietnamese to expect high casualties. As Le Duan declared, "The North will not count the cost." 1968 is the US's bloodiest year of the war, with almost 17,000 fatalities. Through the summer, the North launches more offensives, the so-called mini-Tet. It suffers high losses, but so does the US, with around 400 Americans a week dying in May. By late 1968, 500,000 US troops are in Vietnam, and as troop numbers and casualties increase, more Americans have direct or indirect experience of the war, such as when a relative is sent overseas. All this erodes American public will, a significant factor in any war. As Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz writes, an effective war effort needs equilibrium between the trinity, the state, the army, and the people. After Tet, North Vietnam's trinity remains strong because of government regimentation, but also ideological convictions and nationalist aspirations. Meanwhile, as the 1968 US election looms, the US trinity is falling apart. By late 1968, the chaos of the Vietnam Wars spills into the streets of America as violent protests, political assassinations, and an energetic anti-war movement grab headlines. Meanwhile, low morale and drug abuse are causing discipline issues for the US military in Vietnam. Fresh presidential elections mean the potential for change and possible withdrawal. But before US troops can leave Vietnam, the war will first expand across borders, in the air, and to the streets of Hanoi. The division on the streets is mirrored in the White House. President Lyndon B. Johnson has lost much of the support of his own party and refuses to campaign for a second term. Instead, he distances himself from former advisors and party opposition. His vice president, Hubert Humphrey, leads a faction critical of his Vietnam policies, and both Democrats and Republicans see de-escalation in Vietnam as key to electoral success. Johnson has overseen a shift in Vietnam policy. He replaces General William Westmoreland, U.S. commander in Vietnam since 1965, with General Creighton Abrams. Throughout late 1968, Abrams keeps up offensive pressure on the North Vietnamese with operations like Tuan Tang II, which the U.S. claims kills 25,000 enemy troops. However, Abrams also emphasizes pacification, defections, and selectively targeting Viet Cong figures over big offensives. Despite the changes, the Democrats are down in the polls. Meanwhile, Republican candidate Richard Nixon says that he wants, quote, peace with honor in Vietnam, but leaves the details deliberately vague.
First priority foreign policy objective of our next administration will be bring an honorable end to the war in Vietnam.
By October, Nixon has a clear advantage over Humphrey in the coming election. Despite the differences between Johnson and Humphrey, the president helps Humphrey's chances with an announcement.
As a result of all of these developments, I have now ordered that all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam cease as of 8 a.m. Washington time, Friday morning.
After 3 years and 50,000 North Vietnamese deaths, the US will stop bombing North Vietnam and open negotiations with the North and South Vietnamese governments. The Democrats receive a potentially decisive boost, but it doesn't last. Nixon's team are in secret contact with South Vietnam President Nguyen Phan Thieu and promise him more support under a Republican US government if he sabotages the Democrats' plan. Just before the voting starts, Thieu rejects Johnson's deal, calling off meaningful negotiations and undermining Humphrey. On November 5th, Nixon wins the closely contested election, and the Republicans now head the US war effort. Nixon's priorities in 1969 are to end the US commitment in Vietnam and stabilize the international Cold War. However, abandoning South Vietnam would endanger US global prestige, so Nixon plans to de-escalate and escalate in different areas. Firstly, he will withdraw US troops to reduce losses. Pacification will continue, while the South Vietnamese ARVN will do most of the fighting, a policy known as Vietnamization. The US will pressure North Vietnam to negotiate and accept US demands for northern troops to leave the South. For this, Nixon will rely on international political isolation and threats of overwhelming force. Nixon develops the madman theory, which plays on his well-known reputation as a fiery anti-communist. Using overt, even nuclear threats, he hopes to coerce North Vietnam as he confides to an aide. I want the North Vietnamese to believe I've reached the point where I might do anything to stop the war. We'll slip the word to them that, for God's sake, you know Nixon is obsessed about communism. We can't restrain him when he's angry. And he has his hand on the nuclear button. And Ho Chi Minh himself will be in Paris in 2 days begging for peace. Nixon will use air power to send his message, and he secretly bombs North Vietnamese depots and infrastructure in neighboring Cambodia. Henry Kissinger supports Nixon's approach. Both share a realpolitik theory and a preference for direct individual action. Kissinger develops plans for massive bombing of North Vietnam, but also makes it clear to Nixon coercion, not military victory, is the goal. In Saigon, the tendency is to fight the war to victory. It has to be kept in mind, but you and I know it won't happen. It's impossible. Even General Abrams agreed. And pressure is mounting in North Vietnam. Some leaders call for negotiations too, but militant leaders like Le Duan believe more military victories are essential to earning a good deal. However, the Tet Offensive cost the North dearly. North Vietnamese leaders estimate it will be 3 years before they can mount another offensive. For North Vietnamese civilians and soldiers, some of whom have been fighting for over 10 years, the high casualties and long war are taking a toll. It began to seem like an open pit. There was even a kind of motto that the whole generation of army-age North Vietnamese adopted. They tattooed it on themselves and they sang songs about it. Born in the North, to die in the South. The death of North Vietnamese founder Ho Chi Minh on September 2, 1969 is an additional blow, although he had stepped back from power years earlier. Meanwhile, Nixon's policies are having an effect. A slow but steady US troop withdrawal is underway, from 475,000 in 1969 to 334,000 in 1970. This, along with reforming the draft system, boosts his popularity and decreases protests. Behind the scenes, Nixon encourages the CIA, FBI, and IRS to covertly monitor anti-war movements and opponents. As US troops withdraw, the ARVN takes up more responsibility in defense. In fact, by 1970, the South Vietnamese army is one of the strongest and best equipped in the world, at least on paper. Under Nixon, ARVN expands to 1 million men by 1971. Whereas previously they had surplus World War II equipment, they're now equipped to US standards, including over 1 million M16s and M60 machine guns. Their air force becomes the 4th largest in the world, with more than 2,000 aircraft, mostly Huey helicopters, but also attack aircraft like the A-1 Skyraider and A-37 Dragonfly. But ARVN struggles to translate this material strength into strategic potential. It remains incredibly corrupt, with some officers filling their units with fake ghost soldiers to draw extra pay. There's also little technical knowledge for the new equipment, while the expansion of the armed forces also impacts the South Vietnamese economy, which is already buckling under a refugee crisis. Soldiers' low pay, around $18 a month in 1970, contributes to around 120,000 ARVN troops deserting each year. ARVN soldiers also struggle with a crisis of morale. Most of the South Vietnamese soldiers knew that some members of their family were on the other side. When you shoot into an area, maybe your own blood brother is there. And fighting against communism, what is that? Nobody understood. They knew they were fighting against other Vietnamese, and other Vietnamese were fighting against foreigners. So in our hearts, we had sympathy for the other side. Still, Vietnamization is popular in the US, and in early 1970 the ARVN is put to the test. In neighboring Cambodia, pro-US General Lon Nol launches a coup against Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Sihanouk was officially neutral in the Vietnam War, but did not prevent North Vietnamese forces establishing bases in border regions. On April 30th, 1970, at the apparent invitation of Lon Nol, 80,000 ARVN and US troops move into Cambodia to wipe out communist bases, including the elusive Central Office for South Vietnam, the so-called Bamboo Pentagon. The operation, which is joined by Lon Nol's Cambodian forces, is partially successful, with large amounts of weaponry captured. However, the Viet Cong avoid major combat and withdraw further into Cambodia, taking the Central Office for South Vietnam with them. The US ARVN attack fails to capture any major headquarters and has unintended consequences. Firstly, it pushes North Vietnamese forces into a closer relationship with Cambodian communists of the Khmer Rouge, with devastating long-term consequences for Cambodia. Secondly, it reignites public opposition to the war in the US, culminating in mass protests on college campuses. At Kent State and Jackson State universities, National Guard troops fire on protesters, killing 6 and wounding 21. In November, Nixon addresses the nation, asking the so-called silent majority not protesting the war to unite behind him. Overall, his approval rates are still high, with 59% supporting him according to some polls, but there is dissent within the government and the Senate. Nixon excluded key figures from planning for Cambodia, and senators from both parties attempt to force an end to the incursion through Congress. Senator George McGovern gives an emotional address. Every senator in this chamber is partly responsible for sending 50,000 young Americans to an early grave. This chamber reeks of blood. The amendment fails to pass, and Nixon and Kissinger react by increasing covert surveillance of opposition and critical colleagues, and further centralizing decision-making into Kissinger's National Security Council. But dissent and disenchantment are not limited to the US home front. In Vietnam, the discipline, combat efficiency, and morale of US troops also suffers. Although ARVN is doing more fighting, US troops are still seeing combat. But now that it's clear US troops will be withdrawn, there's little motivation for them to fight and die in Vietnam. In some cases, a lack of direction leads to indiscipline. Desertions, especially troops on leave, increase to 70 out of 1,000 soldiers. For many soldiers, it becomes harder to justify the loss of a comrade. I saw my buddy shot beside me. That's what made me desert. I could think of no good reason why he should die, why I should die, why any GIs should die in Vietnam. To avoid casualties, some units conduct so-called search and evade missions. They find safe areas and make falsified reports or deliberately avoid contact with the enemy. As the number of US troops decreases, those who remain lack purpose and drug use soars. By 1973, the Pentagon estimates 35% of enlisted men try heroin, with 20% addicted during their tour. The men often use alcohol, marijuana, and LSD, although usually away from the front line. However, some soldiers use the methamphetamines or cocaine to stay alert while on operations. General Abrams is frustrated. I've got white shirts all over the place. Psychologists, drug counselors, detox specialists, rehab people. Is this a goddamn army or a mental hospital? Officers are afraid to lead their men into battle, and the men won't follow. Jesus Christ, what happened? Some US troops even turn to fragging, deliberately targeting their own officers with fragmentation grenades. Officers may be fragged for several reasons, like ordering dangerous missions or attempting to limit drug use, and the Department of Defense records 788 incidents between 1969 and 1972, with 86 deaths. Others suggest the death toll may be much higher, especially when mysterious deaths in the field are taken into account. Some estimates run as high as 1,000 US officers and NCOs killed in fragging and shooting incidents, but the exact amount will likely remain unknown. Political and social divisions in the US are also replicated in Vietnam. Commanders vigorously suppress troops' anti-war protests, but racial tensions are harder to control. Although soldiers of all races describe unity in battle, friction boils over on bases. This is especially true after the assassination of Martin Luther King, who was a vocal critic of the war. We are taking young black men and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. So we have been repeatedly faced with the cruel irony of watching Negro and white boys on TV screens as they kill and die together for a nation that has been unable to seat them together in the same schools. Following his death, American troops riot on US bases in Vietnam. Back in the US, some Vietnam veterans are prominent in the protest movement. By 1971, 20,000 have joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War, including future Secretary of State John Kerry. Someone has to die so that President Nixon won't be, and these are his words, the first president to lose a war. We're asking Americans to think about that, because how do you ask a man to be the last man to die in Vietnam? How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake? By early 1971, the war seems to have been fully Vietnamized. US troop levels are at 157,000, and some US officials claim pacification and targeting North Vietnamese agents in the south is having an impact. In February, commanders send Arvin across the border into Laos in a preemptive attack. Operation Lamson 719 aims to capture a North Vietnamese supply depot at Chipon and disrupt North Vietnamese offensives. Congressional limits mean Nixon cannot send US ground troops, although aircraft will provide support. But after modest gains, the North Vietnamese army counterattacks the 15,000-strong Arvin force. President Thieu orders a withdrawal, triggering a chaotic rout back into Vietnam. Arvin losses are up to 8,000 casualties, with 150 vehicles abandoned, including tanks. The defeat is underscored by ongoing domestic troubles in the US. In March, US courts sentenced Lieutenant William Calley to life imprisonment for his role in the 1968 My Lai massacre, in which US troops deliberately murdered around 500 South Vietnamese civilians, including 173 children. Opinion in the US is divided, with one poll showing 65% of respondents are not upset by Calley's actions. 3 days after the conviction, Nixon orders Calley into house arrest, and he's released in 1974. Next, in June 1971, disgruntled Department of Defense official Daniel Ellsberg leaks a bombshell 7,000-page document called the Pentagon Papers to the media. It outlines chaotic US decision-making in Vietnam and concludes they were influenced more by domestic political interests than military or political realities in Vietnam. The result is a decline in the US public support for the war and for the South Vietnamese government. A poll in mid-1971 shows 58% of Americans now believe the war is morally wrong, while 60% favor withdrawal even if it leads to a South Vietnamese collapse. So Nixon and Kissinger revive negotiations with the North. They still demand North Vietnam removes troops from the South, but their priority is now the release of American prisoners. Hanoi demands an end to US bombing and support for Thieu. Nixon attempts to isolate North Vietnam politically by appealing to their allies, including a breakthrough diplomatic mission to China in February 1972. However, he comes away disappointed, since China and the Soviet Union have only limited influence over North Vietnam. The North now feels another offensive could bolster their bargaining power. On March 30th, 1972, they launched the Easter Offensive with 122,000 NVA troops attacking into the south from the north, Cambodia, and Laos. Now equipped with Soviet and Chinese artillery and tanks, including T-54s, the attacks make early progress against Arvin, securing all of Quang Tri province. Their new equipment makes a powerful impact.
Exaggeration? No, sir. I'd like to go back to the night of May the 10th, sir, and it's been estimated we took 7,800 rounds of different caliber indirect fire weapons. That's a good number, sir. We took at least that many. The prep lasted for approximately 10 hours, sir. It started at 1800 in the afternoon, and it lasted till 0400 in the morning. The first 6 hours of the attack was artillery, 105 and 155. Then the mortar started in. I wouldn't even want to guess how many mortar tubes were around, but it was just so intense that it's unbelievable, sir.
Arvin holed out in some locations, but it's US air power, including B-52s and Cobra gunships, which largely stopped the offensive. Even so, North Vietnam keeps some gains. Nixon now becomes highly critical of General Abrams' command and pursues negotiations with renewed urgency. A fresh US election is looming, and with only 24,000 US troops remaining in Vietnam, Nixon is eager to finish the withdrawal and sign a deal. There are two stumbling blocks in the negotiations. The North wants President Thieu removed from power, and the US wants North Vietnamese troops out of South Vietnam. Privately, however, Nixon and Kissinger prioritize US voters' concerns, like the return of POWs. To maintain its global reputation, Kissinger writes the US simply needs a decent interval between US withdrawal and the South's seemingly inevitable collapse. We are ready to withdraw all of our forces by a fixed date and let objective realities shape the political future. We want a decent interval. There is debate about whether the decent interval was official policy, but many senior US officials understand the South's chances of long-term survival are poor. In October, both sides compromise, although the US gives up more. The North agrees to release US prisoners and cooperate with Thieu within a National Council of Reconciliation, while in exchange, the US will withdraw all its troops and recognize the political legitimacy of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, the political wing of the Viet Cong. Decisively, the North will not have to withdraw its military from the South. However, President Thieu rejects the deal. Nixon is outraged, although at least one National Security Council staffer notices an irony. After having said for years that South Vietnam was a sovereign, independent government, we now resented it for acting that way by opposing what was, from their point of view, a poor agreement. Nixon, now backed up by an electoral victory, tries to renegotiate with the North in November, but they refuse. So Nixon resorts to force to break the deadlock, ordering Operation Linebacker 2. From December 18th to 29th, US bombers dropped 36,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam, including Hanoi and Haiphong. That's more than the entire total dropped from 1969 to 71. The attacks killed 2,000 civilians in Hanoi alone, and the North reopens negotiations on December 27th. Historians have debated whether this was really due to the bombing, the damage of which was relatively light thanks to wartime evacuation. The attack also cost the US 27 aircraft to North Vietnamese air defenses. Some historians suggest Thieu had already agreed to return to negotiations before the bombing, and the real intention was to show US strength to China and the Soviet Union. US and international media are generally critical of the attack, with the New York Times calling it, quote, war by tantrum. When negotiations resume on January 8, 1973, a conclusion comes surprisingly quickly. But the New Deal only differs cosmetically from the October Agreement. Importantly, the final Paris Peace Accords signed on January 27th stipulate the North can still maintain forces in the South, and the US will withdraw within 60 days. In those final weeks, the US continues to pump military equipment into the South, and Nixon reassures Thieu if the North attacks, the US will return. By March 30th, 1973, the final contingent of 5,200 US troops leaves Vietnam for good. American involvement in the Vietnam War has come to an end, and South Vietnam stands alone. Even so, all that remains of the US's 8-year involvement in Vietnam is a small US Marine detachment at the Saigon Embassy. Almost immediately, both North and South Vietnam violate the Paris Peace Accords. The North still feels it has the military advantage, while Southern President Nguyen Phan Thieu refuses to deal with communists in a Council of Reconciliation. Fighting also continues. South Vietnamese ARVN forces move into contested zones, although the North avoids large-scale combat to avoid provoking a US return. However, it does re-equip its units with modern equipment and heavy weapons and infiltrates more forces into the South in violation of the agreement. A US return, though, looks unlikely. Congress and the public oppose President Nixon's promise to re-intervene if necessary. Senators from both parties passed legislation limiting presidential power, ordering an end to the bombing of Cambodia and slashing funds to South Vietnam. The Watergate scandal, which reveals Nixon illegally spied on rivals, further limits his influence. Facing impeachment, Nixon resigns in August 1974, but new President Gerald Ford promises to continue to support South Vietnam.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The North now steps up military actions, capturing Phuoc Long in December. The ARVN response is lackluster, so the North intensifies operations in March 1975. They expect the new Ho Chi Minh Offensive to be victorious in 1976, but victory comes much, much sooner. Following diversionary attacks, the North captures Buon Ma Thuot in a surprise raid. Thieu orders a retreat from the central highlands towards Saigon, but it soon becomes a rout. ARVN units collapse as the NVA advances along the coast before swinging towards Saigon. The ARVN holed out at Xuan Loc, but the NVA pushed them back after 12 days of fighting. North Vietnamese forces now attack Saigon. There's a strange, sad giddiness in Saigon. Like the feeling one gets when the score is 56-0 late in the fourth quarter and your team is the one with 0. You aren't happy about the thrashing your team got, but at this point the most merciful thing is for the game to end. There is no US military response, and Thieu resigns on April 21st. Instead, Ford prepares for final evacuations. These become chaotic scenes as thousands of South Vietnamese civilians descend on the airport, which is under attack. The airplane started to move with the door still open. I was looking out the door and saw people running around in all directions, shooting crazily into the air. They seemed to be in a panic. People all around me on the airplane started screaming and crying. Some of them started praying very loudly. The chaos shuts down the airport, so civilians surge to the US Embassy and break in just as the final helicopters depart. The US evacuates 1,000 Americans and 5,500 Vietnamese in 2 days.
Because the Vietnamese people also fight but more than 25 years now. So now we just stop fight, I'm very happy, very happy for a lot of kids and me, also people of the Vietnamese army.
Shortly afterwards, North Vietnamese units enter Saigon to little resistance. On April 30th, NVA tanks crash through the gates of Thieu's presidential palace and the South Vietnamese government surrenders. By May 3rd, the North clears the final areas of the Mekong Delta and the war is over. In 1976, the North announces a unified Socialist Republic of Vietnam, with Saigon renamed Ho Chi Minh City. For the US, their long involvement from at least 1950 is over. For North Vietnam, the struggle for independence arguably started in 1858 against the French. Until 1973, 2.7 million US personnel served in South Vietnam. Of this number, more than 58,000 are killed and 300,000 wounded. The cost of $1 trillion in today's value also led to a growing economic crisis in the US in the 1970s. Counting Vietnamese casualties is harder. Fighting and bombing kills up to 2 million Vietnamese civilians and perhaps up to 1 million North Vietnamese military personnel. The US estimates around 250,000 South Vietnamese military killed in action. But the Vietnam War's legacy goes further than combat casualties. After victory, Northern agents forcibly moved some Vietnamese into so-called re-education camps, perhaps 200,000, though estimates vary. There are reports of political executions of Southern figures, but their scale and frequency remain debated. Vietnam does suffer great economic damage as well. Around 10% of South Vietnam's agricultural land is destroyed, including by US defoliants like Agent Orange. Some also associate these herbicides with an increased rate of cancer and birth defects among both Vietnamese and US veterans. Meanwhile, the North imposes a centralized communist ideology on the South, even concerning some Southern revolutionaries. Not all within the Viet Cong's Provisional Revolutionary Government were communist, and some expected a more pluralistic system. Now, with total power in their hands, they began to show their cards in the most brutal fashion. They made it understood that the Vietnam of the future would be a single, monolithic bloc, collectivist and totalitarian, in which all the traditions and culture of the South would be ground and molded by the political machine of the conquerors. Economic restructuring and post-war tension with China caused 2 million Vietnamese to leave by 1979, including many ethnic Chinese merchants. Many escaped by sea, becoming known as the Boat People. But the Vietnam War's legacy goes beyond the US and Vietnam. Both the US and North Vietnam appeal to allies, both in Indochina and beyond, and expand the war into Laos and Cambodia to seize an all-important advantage. The Vietnam War is often seen as an entirely American intervention in a foreign land, and Vietnamese still refer to the 1965 to 1973 period as the American War. American historians and popular culture mostly focus on US involvement in the war, but thousands of troops from other countries also fought and died, on both sides. When the US enters the Vietnam War in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson hopes an international coalition will join him. Not only will this provide military resources, but also legitimize US actions, both internationally and domestically. He calls on members of SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, a kind of Pacific version of NATO. South Vietnam, like the other former French Indochinese colonies, is barred from joining military alliances, but SEATO claims responsibility for the region anyway. However, few of SEATO's actual members are interested in joining the US. France, having recently withdrawn from the region, has no interest in returning, while Britain claims it cannot intervene as co-chair of the 1954 Geneva Conference, which established North and South Vietnam. But the real reasons are that the British public and governments are more concerned about security in Malaya than in Vietnam. So President Johnson's so-called Many Flags campaign does not rally many flags. However, the Philippines and Thailand do send troops for a price. The US grants the Philippines $80 million in aid and agrees to cover the deployment costs for a 2,300-strong engineering and civic support group. Thailand also receives additional aid, as well as deployment costs for sending the Queen's Cobras, a force of 2,000 troops that grows into a 12,000-strong division. Thailand also allows US air bases in the country. Although Filipino and Thai contributions are modest and potentially driven by economic opportunism, some US allies strongly support intervention. In Australia, Prime Minister Robert Menzies sees threats from both Indonesia and China. He hopes Australian support for US-Vietnam policy will encourage the US to commit to Pacific and Australian security. Menzies' forward defense policy sends Australian advisors to South Vietnam in 1962 and introduces national service in 1964. When US ground forces enter South Vietnam in March 1965, Australians soon follow. Initially, a single Australian battalion joins the US 173rd Airborne Brigade, but cooperation is difficult. Australian equipment, some of it dating back to World War II, is lacking compared to the Americans, but there are other differences. Australian troops, many with jungle experience, prefer small unit actions rather than US operations which favor large-scale deployment and massive force. Australian doctrine often could not rely on available fire support, so Australian units expect to be more self-sufficient and flexible. One US officer is impressed. Aussies used squads to make contact and brought in reinforcing elements to do the killing. They planned in the belief that a platoon on the battlefield could do anything, including get out. I still maintain the Australians understood the war better than our guys ever would. Eventually, the Australian presence grows into a separate Australian task force with air support and a small number of New Zealand artillery. Operating in Phuoc Thai province, they rely on methodical patrols, village pacification, and ambushes rather than US-style search and destroy. On August 18, 1966, one such patrol encounters a force of 2,000 Viet Cong in a rubber plantation at Long Tan. The VC kills several Australians in the opening moments and move to surround the lightly equipped Australian units. But D Company 6th Battalion holds off VC assaults with the aid of artillery, while Royal Australian Air Force Hueys drop ammunition and medical supplies. As torrential monsoon rain falls, armored personnel carriers and reinforcements fight through the Viet Cong to relieve D Company. I remember the deafening noise from small arms and artillery, the torrential rain making positive identification of friend or foe extremely hard. My movement forward to 10th Platoon with the radio, and when all seemed lost as the enemy assembled for a final assault, which I firmly believe would have been very difficult for us to repulse, the arrival of our APCs. The relief and joy that flooded us. The Viet Cong withdraw, and Australian follow-up operations eliminate large VC units from the province, although the wider VC infrastructure remains in place. Australian jungle and pacification experience from Malaya and Indonesia and their different tactics are responsible for the partial success. Unlike US bases, which employ many Vietnamese civilians and include ARVN personnel, the Australian Task Force base is closed to Vietnamese. As a result, VC informants among workers and ARVN troops cannot accurately estimate Australian strength or predict operations. According to one statistic, VC units instigate around 3/4 of combat against US troops, but fire first in just 6.7% of encounters with Australian troops. 2/3 of one battalion's contacts resulted from their own ambushes of the VC. All told, 60,000 Australians serve in Vietnam. But the second largest foreign contribution to South Vietnam's defense doesn't come from a SEATO member. South Korea sends 320,000 troops to Vietnam, with force levels peaking at 50,000 in 1969. The contribution is presented as thanks for US intervention in the Korean War, although South Korea also gains extensive US economic and military aid. The US modernizes the South Korean military, contributes to social welfare, and arranges deals with US companies. President Johnson insists the deal is not rewards for mercenaries, but promotes long-term South Korean security. Some historians suggest the agreement kickstarts South Korea as a major world economy. South Korean troops in Vietnam gain a reputation for aggression and brutality, perhaps due to strict disciplinarian officers or personal animosity towards communism. Whatever the source, it finds a use in Vietnam. Often fighting alongside US forces, Korean soldiers are sometimes given dangerous roles, like infiltrating VC tunnels, or they're turned on suspected enemy villages. In one raid, a US lieutenant recalls, "Whatever else the Koreans did in the village was their own business. But with their reputation for brutality, we all knew that the village would be loath to support the Viet Cong so openly in the future. If we got our kills, we could take full credit, and if the ROKs became overzealous, we could plead our lack of control over our allies." As the US withdraws from 1969 on, their allies do the same. In the later war years, Allied troops experienced many of the same frustrations as US soldiers, especially an inability to fundamentally destroy the enemy and a poor relationship with the ARVN. Modest but growing protests in both Australia and South Korea also encourage withdrawal. By 1973, all allies are out of Vietnam. US allies' losses are 4,400 South Koreans, 512 Australians, 351 Thai, 37 New Zealanders, and 9 Filipinos killed. SEATO itself becomes a casualty as it's disbanded in 1977. The US doesn't only look for allies abroad. Within Vietnam itself, especially in its border and mountainous areas, are ethnic minorities willing to fight. One of the best-known groups are the Montagnards, an umbrella term for many different highland ethnic groups. From 1961, US Special Forces recruit Montagnards into Civilian Irregular Defense Groups, or CIDGs. Australian advisors working within the US 5th Special Forces Group also provide training. Montagnards are often Christian and have their own ethnic identities, which makes them suspicious to both the North and South Vietnamese governments. Even so, US Special Forces recognize them as capable, competent, and self-reliant fighters, as an American officer reports. To my surprise, I discovered that the CIDG troops are not the band of unskilled, disorganized, and disgruntled peasants I had envisioned. They are, in fact, closely knit religious or ethnic minority groups with a fierce loyalty to each other and to those who will treat them with respect and consideration. Initially, the CIDGs provide local defense, but US Special Forces extend their role to mobile unconventional forces. Small teams of US and Vietnamese Special Forces work beside groups of Montagnards to conduct patrols and ambushes. Montagnards use their local knowledge as scouts, interpreters, and interrogators to provide intelligence and proactively hunt the VC. Their methods evolve throughout the conflict, including building Special Forces camps for operations in enemy territory. These so-called fighting camps are designed to be functional, cheap, and quick to build. By using local materials and labor, each costs only about $10,000 US. They also need to be easily defendable by small garrisons of CIDGs and Special Forces, and to use principles of defense in depth with multiple layers of barbed wire, mines, trip flares, machine guns, mortars, and earthen ramparts and bunkers. But fighting camps are not merely fortresses in enemy territory. They're used for proactive operations, including setting up ambushes. During my tour in Vietnam, I've seen a steady improvement in the fighting spirit and military proficiency of the CIDG. The most notable example of this occurred on 8th April 1967. 3 platoons from Camp Trong Dung, without US or Vietnamese Special Forces present, were deployed south and east of the camp in a night ambush position, when an NVA company attacked a regional forces outpost. The CIDG platoons moved to cut off the enemy withdrawal, killing 42 NVA and capturing 20 weapons. By late 1967, special forces and Montagnard camps spread across South Vietnam, especially in areas of high enemy activity. Included in this are camps on stilts built along the Mekong River, complete with floating landing pads. Such camps provide CIDGs a degree of operational flexibility impossible with conventional troops, including airborne, riverborne, and nighttime operations. In many cases, CIDG forces locate and pin the enemy while conventional forces rush to the location. In some areas, CIDGs and special forces provide 50% of MACV's ground intelligence. And as small, secretive units, they can be used in cross-border incursions into neutral Cambodia and Laos without major political ramifications. Relations between US Green Berets and Montagnard are good, especially since the special forces live beside their allies and learn from as well as instruct them. But there were also failures. Relations with South Vietnamese regular troops are poor, even resulting in a Montagnard uprising in 1964. Some commanders fail to fully understand or utilize unconventional forces, either seeing them as simply a strategic reserve or splitting up tightly knit groups. Even so, the lessons learned in Vietnam would go on to influence modern special forces operations. But it isn't just the US and South Vietnamese who benefit from alliances. In fact, North Vietnam arguably gains the most from foreign aid and cooperation. Since the 1950s, the Soviet Union and China send military aid to Ho Chi Minh's forces. The amount of aid fluctuates over time, as does the main contributor. At first, China provides the most arms, while the Soviet Union urges caution. Once the US intervenes, though, the Soviet Union increases support, including military advisors. There are other factors at play as well. Both China and the Soviet Union want to position themselves as the leading communist supporter of revolutionary movements, a competition made more intense by the growing Sino-Soviet ideological split. But non-ideological strategic concerns might be more important. China sees Vietnam as an important buffer and economic zone, while US preoccupation with Vietnam gives the Soviet Union a freer hand in Europe. Some historians argue China provides quantity aid and the Soviet Union quality. Between 1956 and 1975, China gives economic grants and moves huge amounts of small arms, artillery, and vehicles into North Vietnam. It also sends around 320,000 Chinese engineering and anti-aircraft troops to the north, where they operate weapons and maintain communication and transport lines. This frees up significant manpower for the North Vietnamese regular army. But Chinese supplies fluctuate throughout the years, reflecting growing tension within the communist camp. In 1964, the Soviet Union becomes a more reliable partner. They send KGB and GRU agents to establish communications and intelligence, although the most important contribution is air defense, including modern surface-to-air missiles and MiG-21 fighters. US Air Force pilots, some of them veterans of the Korean War, noticed the improvements in the North Vietnamese anti-air capabilities.
Last year, they had plenty of AAA and some SAMs, but yet this year they've at least their defenses are considerably heavier this year than they were last year, and the SAM threat has increased significantly. The MiGs are considerably more active this year than they were last year.
And the USSR also benefits from this agreement. Air defense forms a central part of their Cold War nuclear strategy, and Vietnam provides an ideal test environment for their weapon systems. Captured and crashed US equipment is sent to Moscow for analysis, while Soviet intelligence provides technical questions for POW interrogation. Some American POWs also report the presence of Soviet officers. On some rare occasions, Soviet troops participate in combat as anti-aircraft units, though in most cases they train and direct North Vietnamese troops. We turned out to be not bad teachers. In total, our regiment had fired 43 missiles and downed 23 planes. When a shot-down US pilot was told the crews were Vietnamese, he did not believe it. He said that the job smelled Russian. There are claims that Soviet pilots on training flights with North Vietnamese students dogfight US aircraft, but this area is understudied and most evidence is anecdotal. North Korea, though, does send around 200 pilots to support the North Vietnamese Air Force. Other socialist nations also provide support. Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and Bulgaria send economic and military supplies, while Communist Cuba also dispatches advisors. Some US prisoners later claim Cubans work as prison guards and interrogators. Despite public announcements about international communist cooperation, relations between North Vietnam and its allies are mixed. Hanoi complains about unilateral Soviet intelligence gathering in Vietnam, while Chinese relations, already tense due to historical animosity, suffer towards the end of the conflict, especially after President Nixon's 1972 visit to Beijing. The imperialists pursue a policy of détente with some big countries to have a free hand to bully the small countries and stamp out the national liberation movement. China shrinking from its lofty international duties not only is detrimental to revolutionary movements in the world, but will also bring unfathomable harm to itself in the end. Chinese military and economic aid to Vietnam ends abruptly in 1975 after the fall of Saigon. Long term, this pushes the new Socialist Republic of Vietnam closer to the Soviet Union and further weakens relations with China. Vietnamese nationalism, Chinese economic decline, and support for the genocidal regime of Cambodian leader Pol Pot eventually leads to fresh conflict between China and Vietnam, turning a former friend into Vietnam's most dangerous foe. Despite its name, the Vietnam War is not confined to the territory of North or South Vietnam. As the US and North Vietnamese escalate operations, the war crosses borders, merges with neighboring conflicts, and takes on different forms, from CIA-directed secret armies in Laos to genocide in Cambodia. The former French colonies of Laos and Cambodia see some anti-French resistance in the 1950s, but not on the scale of Vietnam. The 1954 Geneva Accords proclaimed the former colonies as neutral, independent states free from foreign military interference, but this doesn't last long. By the late 1950s, several factions share power in the Laotian capital of Vientiane. Prime Minister Prince Suvarnabhumi heads a neutralist faction, while his half-brother Prince Supanupong leads a leftist faction, including the Communist Lao People's Party, or Pathet Lao. Prince Boon a cousin of the other princes, controls a right-wing faction. In 1959, rightist repression of the Pathet Lao results in a rural insurgency. In 1960, neutralist leaders purge the government of rightists and offer concessions to the Pathet Lao. But on December 4th, rightist General Phumi Nosawan launches a coup with US military assistance and captures Vientiane after a 3-day artillery barrage. The neutralists and Pathet Lao evacuate with the help of Soviet aircraft. However, the rightist Royal Lao Army is corrupt and inept and loses ground to the Pathet Lao and neutralists, especially in the Plain of Jars, a flat area where road networks converge. Initially, the US is more concerned with the crisis in Laos than Vietnam. President Dwight D. Eisenhower allows covert military training of the Laotian army as well as economic aid, more per capita than any other country at the time. In 1961, President Kennedy inherits the commitment and explains to voters the role Laos plays in the growing tensions in Vietnam.
In this military advance, the local communist forces, known as the Pathet Lao, have had increasing support and direction from outside. Soviet planes, I regret to say, have been conspicuous in a large-scale airlift into the battle area. Over 1,000 sorties since last December 13th, plus a whole supporting set of combat specialists, mainly from communist North Vietnam, and heavier weapons have been provided from outside, all with the clear object of destroying by military action the agreed neutrality of Laos.
The failure of the CIA-directed April 1961 invasion of Cuba makes Kennedy skeptical of CIA abilities, but he also rules out conventional support for Laos. So he expands the CIA's program of training and resupply. To avoid violating the Geneva Accords, military personnel are officially civilians, including pilots for Air America, the CIA's covert airline. But CIA operatives like Bill Lair are unhappy with the Lao Army, as one National Security Council staffer complains. "We discovered the Laotians were not Turks. They would not stand up and fight." So the CIA looks to allies elsewhere. Neighboring Thailand is strongly anti-communist and provides bases and special forces to support US operations. Together, they also look for allies among different ethnic groups in Laos, especially the Highland Hmong. Ethnically and culturally distinct from the lowland Lao, the Hmong are fiercely independent. Although they're not very interested in ideological struggles, they do worry about Vietnamese encroachment on their territory. The US identifies Major General Vang Pao, the only Hmong commander in the Laotian army, as a reliable partner and starts training Hmong fighters in secret. One of the first is Mua Tao. We walked by foot for 3 days to reach Padang, and 2 airplanes came in and dropped the guns and ammunition. They issued the guns, ammunition, hand grenades, and 57mm recoilless cannons. We received 3 days quick training. Those guns were new for Hmong people, so we needed to learn how to keep them, learn how to operate and clean them in 3 days. In their first clashes with the Pathet Lao, who are now supported by North Vietnam, the Hmong lose their base at Padang in June 1961. However, the CIA are impressed with their fighting spirit. The agency ups its target to train 10,000 fighters in the so-called Armée clandestine, the secret army, to contain the Pathet Lao in the Plain of Jars. The Pathet Lao, though, continue to advance. In April 1962, Nosawan loses his political base at Nam Ta, and with it, US confidence. Meanwhile, the Hmong establish a new base at Long Tieng. With Nosawan politically weakened, an international treaty forms a fragile coalition of all Laotian factions and orders all foreign military to leave. The Soviet Union does step back, but the North Vietnamese ignore the request. The US moves its agents to Thailand and continues covert support from there. In 1963, the Laotian coalition falls apart and fighting resumes. This time, the Pathet Lao fight their former allies in the neutralist faction. As the Laotian government increasingly relies on the Hmong and CIA support, the Pathet Lao become dependent on North Vietnam. By 1964, the Laotian Civil War is firmly connected to the Vietnam conflict. North Vietnam establishes a logistical highway to South Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, through much of Laos, with a major base at Chipon. With the US military getting more involved in Vietnam, they hope the Hmong and others can tie up North Vietnamese forces and interrupt the trail. Bombing becomes vitally important to government forces. Initially, Thai and Laotian pilots in upgun T-28 trainers provide close air support, but soon US pilots are flying Laotian-marked aircraft. Prince Suwana is concerned bombing undermines his sovereignty, but the US pressures him to accept. By December 1964, US command formalizes bombing in Laos as Operation Barrel Roll. American forward air observers, known as Ravens, arrive, and the Air Force targets the Plain of Jars with 2 missions a week in 1964, but 140 a week by 1966. The Plain of Jars becomes one of the most intensely bombed locations in history. Despite the scale of US bombing in Laos, it's officially secret, as is the Americans fighting on the ground. As the US shifts its focus to Vietnam, combat in Laos falls into a seasonal cycle. The Hmong, using airlifts, make gains in the wet season, while the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese advance on the roads in the dry season. The CIA tries to turn the Hmong into a more offensive, conventional force, but internal disagreements and the personalities of influential operatives slow progress. One controversial agent, Anthony Poshepny, becomes known for collecting Pathet Lao ears. I used to collect ears, you know. I had a big green reinforced cellophane bag as you walked up my steps. I'd tell my people to put them in and send them to Vientiane with the report. Sent them only once or twice, and then the goddamn office girls were sick for a week. Putrid when they opened up the envelope, you know? Ear collecting is soon discontinued. Despite air support, the Laotian government still suffers on the ground. Rampant corruption inflates troop numbers, while some commanders sell US equipment to Burmese opium cartels and take up drug running themselves. The CIA doesn't do much about it, and the opium often reaches US troops in Vietnam. By 1968, the Pathet Lao and NVA are on the offensive, seizing Nam Bac and overrunning a secret US radar base at Phu Pha Tri. When President Johnson ends the bombing of North Vietnam in late 1968, he compensates by more bombing in Laos, including with B-52 bombers. The scale of such bombing is hard to hide, and by 1969 the secret is out. The new US President, Richard Nixon, defends US actions, but also announces his intention to withdraw from Vietnam. Hmong forces therefore go on the offensive to win a decisive victory before the US leaves the region. In late summer, supported by massive US bombing, they capture the plain of Jars. By February 1970, though, the Pathet Lao recapture the plains. Meanwhile, conventional offensives are draining Hmong manpower, so Thailand sends troops to help. South Vietnam also operates across the border in 1971, but fails to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail or help the Hmong. By late 1971, Vang Pao's Hmong army is breaking apart. It has suffered 3,300 killed in the last 2 years and is starting to rely on teenage recruits. US bombing prevents a Pathet Lao victory in 1972, and following the 1973 Paris Accords, the war in Laos officially ends with the war in Vietnam. Unlike in Vietnam, major fighting does stop as a new coalition government, including the Pathet Lao, take over. However, the North Vietnamese continue to attack the Hmong, who no longer have US support. We helped the United States for 14 years. Now, they were leaving us without looking back. We didn't know when the communists came what they were going to do to us. Are they going to kill us, or are they going to put us in re-education camps? By 1975, the Pathet Lao dominates the government, abolishes the monarchy, and installs Supanupong as prime minister. It's mostly a non-violent takeover, but they do send 40,000 Laotians to re-education camps and continue to attack the Hmong. The Laotian Civil War kills up to 200,000 Laos civilians and military, about 10% of the pre-war population. 728 Americans are killed, mostly pilots and CIA personnel, while the Hmong lose 30,000. Faced with threats of annihilation, around 50,000 Hmong and other minorities flee, with many settling in the US. Overall, 250,000 Laotians become refugees. Throughout the war, the US drops 2.75 million tons of bombs on Laos, roughly the same amount as dropped in Europe in World War II. Up to 1/3 fail to explode, and leftover munitions remain a significant threat today. Laos suffers terribly, but its neighbor Cambodia arguably suffers most from the conflict in Indochina, as war makes way for genocide. Like Laos, Cambodia is neutralized by the 1954 Geneva Accords. New Cambodian Prime Minister Norodom Sihanouk benefits from French concessions prior to the agreement, and anti-colonial sentiment is low. As a result, unlike in Laos, North Vietnamese insurgents leave. Until the late 1960s, Sihanouk develops a mostly neutralist stance. He rejects US support, even breaking relations in 1965, and maintains contact with North Vietnam despite long-standing animosity. I have always adopted a realist attitude. Heaven has made Vietnam our neighbor for eternity, and it was numbering in the 1960s in the north and south nearly 50 million inhabitants, about 8 times more than Cambodia then. Red or blue, it was a very dangerous neighbor, to be handled with care. He also tries to balance internal divisions. On the left, he's opposed by the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party, or Khmer Rouge, led by Salot Sar, later known as Pol Pot. But their 5,000 poorly trained rebels face 30,000 government troops. Originally, the Khmer Rouge is an urban movement, but government suppression forces them into highland tribal areas where political mobilization faces cultural barriers. Almost every night we would receive instruction in politics. We would receive lectures about communism and the revolution and world affairs. They spoke to us in the Khmer language, and nobody understood a word of it. The Khmer Rouge received little assistance from North Vietnam, which is aligning with the Soviet Union, and is worried by the Khmer Rouge's more radical, Chinese-aligned Maoist ideology. More importantly, North Vietnam prioritizes their own war, and as long as Sihanouk allows North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia for attacks into South Vietnam, Hanoi lets him be. But North Vietnamese troops in Cambodia do trigger US action. In March 1969, President Nixon orders the secret bombing of NVA troops in Cambodia, and US officials falsify reports to cover it up. Then in March 1970, while Sihanouk is abroad, pro-US General Lon Nol launches a coup, announces a Khmer Republic, and requests US support. Now exiled, Sihanouk heads up the Front Uni National du Kampuchea, or FUNK, an anti-Lon Nol coalition that includes the Khmer Rouge. The US doesn't help Lon Nol's takeover, but benefits from it, since Washington can now frame US actions in Cambodia as helping an ally. In April 1970, US and South Vietnamese troops launch a major cross-border attack against North Vietnamese bases in Cambodia. It's a modest success, but causes protests in the US against expanding the war. Bombing, the coup, and the US invasion bring the Khmer Rouge and North Vietnamese closer together, with the NVA providing 10,000 troops. Against a poorly motivated and corrupt government army, the Communists seize 2/3 of the country by October 1970. But North Vietnam does not want to see a victory yet. Ultimately, North Vietnam wants a Cambodian communist regime it controls, and it doesn't control FUNK. It tries to do so with Hanoi-trained Cambodian agents, but this and its preference for Sihanouk over the Khmer Rouge leads to tensions. These are made worse by historical border disputes, Vietnamese nationalism, and a patronizing attitude towards Cambodians noted by Soviet Ambassador Ilya Sherbakov. At times, the narrowly nationalistic approach of the Vietnamese comrades to the solution of the problems of Indochina is too obvious, and the noticeable attempts by them of subordination of the problems of Laos and Cambodia to the interests of Vietnam results in the concealed discontent of the Laotian and Cambodian friends. As early as 1971, Khmer Rouge agents expel and occasionally assassinate Vietnamese and Hanoi-trained communist agents and solidify their control by removing pro-Sihanouk figures and denouncing his so-called feudal regime. In early 1973, they even attack NVA troops in border sanctuaries. North Vietnam doesn't react, since it has just signed the Paris Peace Accords and wants to focus on its final offensive against South Vietnam, not fighting Cambodian communists. Meanwhile, despite withdrawing from South Vietnam, the US massively steps up bombing in Cambodia, triggering debate at home. The US Congress receives letters of protest from US aircrew. I am an AC-130 gunship navigator, fighting the war in Cambodia on a day-to-day basis. I come as close as one can get to observe the conflict at hand. What I see is an absurd effort by my commander-in-chief to preserve an unpopular, corrupt, dictatorial government at any expense. We have become once again involved in a civil conflict, and as a result of our involvement have escalated the death and destruction on a massive scale. Congress demands the bombing stop by August 15th and slashes funding for US operations in Indochina. Just before the deadline, US bombing prevents a Khmer Rouge assault on Phnom Penh. But without long-term US support, the Cambodian government is vulnerable, especially since China increases support for the Khmer Rouge in 1974. In January 1975, the Khmer Rouge resumed the offensive and besiege Phnom Penh. They capture the city in April, and Lon Nol flees to the US. Publicly, North Vietnam praises the communist victory in Cambodia, but privately they worry. The Khmer Rouge have won without direct North Vietnamese assistance, reducing Hanoi's influence over the new communist state. Sihanouk officially becomes president of Cambodia, but Pol Pot and his clique soon put him under house arrest and announce a new state of democratic Kampuchea and a new revolutionary era. Pol Pot calls his program Year Zero. He orders cities emptied as part of a hyper-Maoist agricultural revolution. He denounces outside influence and calls for a return of the ancient Angkor kingdom as a simple agrarian state. The party violently represses intellectuals, urban professionals, Buddhist priests, Muslim tribespeople, and many ordinary Cambodians. Starvation, overwork, and executions kill up to 2.8 million people, around a third of the pre-war population, with many suffering torture in specially established facilities.
In
the 2 years that I was here, I would hear people screaming when I was working here, the prisoners who were being tortured in the building next door. And sometimes we'd hear people being tortured with electricity and they would fall over in shock. Sometimes they would attach electrical wires to the testicles or to the ears of the prisoner. Sometimes they would cut people's stomachs open and take out their liver.
Publicly, North Vietnam applauds Cambodian achievements in state propaganda. Liberated Cambodia is living in a new and healthy atmosphere. But tensions continue. In May 1975, Vietnamese and Cambodian forces clash over disputed islands in the Gulf of Thailand. Both sides play down the violence and reconfirm pacts of friendship in August. Hanoi still hopes a pro-Vietnamese faction may emerge in Cambodia, and it's reluctant to provoke China, which supports Cambodia. Privately, however, Vietnamese leader Le Duan confides in the Soviet ambassador. Pol Pot's clique are a pro-Chinese sect conducting a crude and severe policy. These are bad people. Militarily, Vietnam has a huge advantage, with around 685,000 troops backed up by 900 tanks and 300 aircraft. The Khmer Rouge barely has 70,000 troops with few tanks and virtually no aircraft. Despite this, the Khmer Rouge launched raids into Vietnam in April 1977, killing 200 civilians. Le Duan believes the raids are designed to provoke Vietnam into hasty action and urges restraint. Government propaganda continues to praise Cambodia and hides the attacks from the public. Vietnam finally responds in December 1977, invading one province before withdrawing in January. Pol Pot steps up internal purges of suspected pro-Vietnamese figures, including many experienced commanders. The Khmer Rouge kills about half of the Cambodian communists who secured victory in 1975. Vietnam wants to start reconstruction, demobilize its large army, and deal with a growing economic crisis, which it cannot do with a Chinese-supported Cambodia on its border. Many Vietnamese nationalists also want an Indochina dependent on and dominated by Vietnam. While the Pathet Lao was relatively easy to control, they see stronger anti-Vietnamese sentiment in the Khmer Rouge as a problem. In December 1978, Vietnam launches a full-scale invasion with 150,000 troops. Advancing from 3 directions, they rapidly overwhelm Cambodian forces. Faced with more purges, 30,000 Khmer Rouge soldiers desert, with many supporting Vietnamese forces. On January 7, 1979, Vietnam captures Phnom Penh and Pol Pot escapes to the western mountains. Vietnam installs a pro-Hanoi government in Cambodia, and Prince Sihanouk flees abroad and eventually establishes the coalition government of Democratic Kampuchea, an anti-Vietnamese coalition including both non-communist guerrillas and the Khmer Rouge. The US, Thailand, and Britain support him as they all oppose Vietnamese control over Cambodia. Thus, to prevent Vietnamese hegemony over Indochina, the United States, Thailand, and 2 non-communist Cambodian armies tied themselves to a strange marriage of convenience with the murderers of millions, the Khmer Rouge, and the People's Republic of China. The Vietnamese occupation lasts until 1989 and ends the Cambodian genocide. At least for some Cambodians, the arrival of Vietnamese troops is seen as a liberation from the Khmer Rouge.
The Vietnamese are the only troop which fight Pol Pot, who is their first enemy. See, and also, many people in the countryside and in the city told me that the Vietnamese don't bother them. They are allowed to do whatever they want, and sometimes they get on well with one another and they help with one another with their works. So it's fine for everyone.
However, the Vietnamese invasion is not a humanitarian mission. Instead, Vietnam's primary interests are their own nationalistic priorities. Hanoi's intervention in Cambodia is a gamble, as it worsens already bad relations with China. Vietnam is closer to the Soviet Union, which has split from China and moves away from a Mao-inspired agricultural revolution. Territorial disputes over the Paracel and Spratly Islands are also a problem, and China fears Vietnam's growing population, self-confidence, and economic and military potential as a regional power. Vietnam's occupation of Cambodia is the tipping point. On February 17, 1979, the Sino-Vietnamese War begins, also known in China as the self-defensive counterattack against Vietnam, and in Vietnam as the war against Chinese expansionism. In total, around 120,000 Chinese troops cross into Vietnam, opposed by 120,000 mostly irregular Vietnamese troops. The Chinese capture Lang Son, but run into strong resistance towards Hanoi. After 17 days of fighting, China withdraws, claiming it has punished Vietnam enough. Both sides lose around 10,000 killed. With the end of the Sino-Vietnamese War, Indochina enjoys tentative peace. Vietnamese and Chinese artillery duel across the border throughout the 1980s, while Pol Pot continues a low-level Khmer Rouge insurgency in Cambodia and in Thailand. Only in 1998, with Pol Pot's arrest and subsequent death, does the Khmer Rouge finally disband. By this time, Vietnam has normalized relations with the US, while new treaties turn former battlefield foes into trade partners and perhaps even strategic allies.
This would, of course, represent a historic event, representing the final chapter in the transformation of our relationship from adversaries to trading partners.
Today, recent polls suggest around 3/4 of Vietnamese view the US favorably, although this is somewhat unreciprocated, with only 1/3 of Americans feeling the same way towards Vietnam. And so, although the war wounds between nations may have diplomatically healed, the memories of the Vietnam War, for some, remain vivid. The Vietnam War, even in its first years, has always caused heated debate, as it still does today. Many struggle to understand how North Vietnam could defeat the military might of the US, while some claim the US wasn't defeated at all. Nixon felt his agreement provided peace with honor and later claimed we had won the war. Critics, though, point out the peace agreement included major US concessions, while allowing the North to keep military forces in the South. General Westmoreland complained the deal amounted to surrendering the field to the enemy and the de facto end of South Vietnamese sovereignty. Secretary of State Dean Rusk called it, quote, a surrender. Others, like Nixon's Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, point out that Washington didn't really expect the South to last, and the agreement was designed to cover a US withdrawal with some semblance of respectability. We know the goddamn agreement will probably not work, but we've got to be in the position where if it doesn't, it will be the result of the other side. At the very least, this was clearly not a US victory, but a strategic defeat, as historian Gregory Daddis concludes. True, the US withdrawal advanced as a matter of policy rather than collapse. Yet judged on what it left behind, one seems hard-pressed to argue the US military won its war. So why did the US fail in Vietnam? Debate also rages on this question, with a person's position often differing based on their professional role, political background and beliefs, and proximity to wartime decision-making. Some see the roots of US defeat in a failure of execution in Vietnam. This viewpoint often suggests US intervention in Vietnam had good intentions, but practical problems, strategic errors, and poor judgment hindered operations. Later in life, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara outlined a long list of causes for the US defeat, focusing on US hubris, a lack of understanding of Vietnamese history, and over-reliance on military might. General Westmoreland's attritional strategy is often criticized, especially its focus on kill counts. Critics say this approach, although gaining many tactical victories for the US, failed to address the actual critical element of the Vietnam struggle: the rival political legitimacy of North and South Vietnam. US leaders disregarded North Vietnam as merely a Sino-Soviet puppet, whose forces could be systematically destroyed as a hostile foreign army. But North Vietnam was largely independent and represented sincere and widespread nationalist aspirations. By wrongly attributing the conflict to external sources, the United States drastically misjudged its internal dynamics. By intervening in what was essentially a local struggle, it placed itself at the mercy of local forces, a weak client, and a determined adversary. Some US offensive operations are also of limited value and rarely develop the political legitimacy of the Southern government. Even some victories are counterproductive. For example, in May 1969, the 101st Airborne Division stormed NVA trenches on Hill 937, better known as Hamburger Hill. After 7 days of intense fighting, the 101st took the hill with 450 casualties, only to abandon it to the NVA several days later. The hill itself held little strategic value, and the battle came to typify wasteful US attacks. Or as journalist Jonathan Schell wrote, "The more we won, the more we lost." Regardless, some see consistent US tactical victory as evidence the US did not lose the Vietnam War, but others question this logic. Firstly, although the US defeated every major North Vietnamese offensive and performed larger-scale search and destroy missions, most combat in Vietnam was small-scale. 96% of firefights involved less than 200 US soldiers, and the North Vietnamese instigated around 75% of all combat, giving them a distinct advantage. There is no reliable data on who won these countless small-scale actions, but the fact that the US never destroyed the North's ability to launch them weakens claims of US military victory. And military victories are a means to political victory, not a means to an end in themselves. As Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz claimed, war is the continuation of politics, and victory comes not from killing more of the enemy, but using force to settle the political questions over which the war is fought. US battlefield successes did not prevent Northern political victory, as a US negotiator in Hanoi recalled. "You know, you never beat us on the battlefield," I told my North Vietnamese army counterpart. "That may be so," he replied, "but it is also irrelevant." But even those who accept this conclusion are quick to point out the blame does not ultimately rest with the common US soldier. Who ultimately takes responsibility is another hot topic. President Nixon blamed Congress, while some military leaders blamed the civilian government. "In the end, we sent our sons to be maimed and crippled and to die for naught, because the political leaders of this country lost their will. There was no lack of courage or skill on the battlefield. The lack of fortitude was solely in the corridors of power in Washington." As early as 1967, military officers began to complain that they were fighting with, quote, "one arm tied behind their backs." President Johnson refused to allow a conventional invasion of North Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos, where North Vietnamese forces operated freely. Westmoreland understood cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail in neighboring countries was vital to isolating the battlefield and did try to strengthen border security, but it wasn't enough. Even when incursions into Cambodia and Laos were allowed under Nixon, they achieved little. Westmoreland and his supporters claimed the source of the attritional strategy was really President Johnson's civilian advisors, the so-called wise men. They say figures like Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, and Walt Rostow had a disastrous influence by insisting military strategy fit into new methods of quantitative analytics. It was this, they argue, not an obsession with firepower, which prioritized kill counts and an attritional strategy. Pacification efforts would require even more troops and result in lower kill counts. Some military figures like Colonel Harry Summers, while blaming civilian leaders, also argue the Joint Chiefs of Staff provided poor strategic planning and failed to adequately brief presidents. Another argument is that Vietnam was not lost in the jungle, but on the streets of America. Public dissent to the war certainly had an impact in pressuring US leaders. Public support is critical in any war, especially limited wars in which national survival is not at stake. It's undeniable that public outrage helped end US involvement, but where did it come from? One common suggestion is that the US media misrepresented the war to the public and gave small-scale tactical events strategic significance through graphic reporting and media framing. Most famously, the photo of Phan Thi Kim Phu, a South Vietnamese girl wounded by napalm, raised serious questions about US methods. General Westmoreland was especially critical of reporting during the 1968 Tet Offensive. Voluminous, lurid and distorted newspaper and particularly television reporting of the Tet Offensive had transformed a devastating communist military defeat into a psychological victory. Critical US reports did increase after Tet, but before Tet, coverage was largely supportive. The media often promoted optimistic government claims, and some news editors suppressed negative stories to maintain connections in the White House or to appeal to audiences. Within the Cold War context, disloyalty was considered economic suicide. But the media did play a role expanding the credibility gap between government claims and the reality in Vietnam, resulting in more anti-war sentiment. However, it has been debated how much the media created this dissent rather than reinforcing pre-existing opinions. By the time media became more critical, public opinion and civic and political leaders had already shifted the conversation and the news marketplace. In this sense, instead of developing anti-war sentiment, the media may have simply followed it as a business decision. Domestic news coverage of protests and political revelations may have also been more influential than television war coverage from Vietnam. Covering protests publicized and normalized them as a legitimate activity, while major stories like the My Lai massacre and Pentagon Papers were released by American domestic journalists and were first exposed by ex-military figures. Initially, no major news outlet would publish the My Lai massacre reporting. Overall, viewership of television network news was lower than commonly believed, and less than half of TV owners claimed to watch it. Susan Carruthers, a professor specializing in the media and war, concludes, television may have confirmed the trend towards disillusionment, but many academics are adamant that television did not set it. Indeed, it was, in fact, considerably to its rear. Regardless of its actual impact, the idea that the media lost the war became attractive to post-Vietnam officers and affects US media-military relations to this day. Some highlight media figures such as news anchor Walter Cronkite or actress Jane Fonda, who visited North Vietnam, as traitors who undermined the US war effort. Others argue their impact has been grossly overstated, and instead they function as easy scapegoats for deeper military and political failings. But many of these arguments about US defeat focus almost exclusively on the US itself. But as the saying goes, the enemy also gets a vote. By 1975, revolutionary nationalist forces in Vietnam had already fought a series of wars over 30 years. They gained experience, but also the ideological conviction to see through the struggle. Their experiences also taught North Vietnamese leaders that strategic flexibility was essential to defeat a more powerful enemy. North Vietnam shifted regularly from conventional to unconventional operations, navigated the Sino-Soviet ideological split to their advantage, and maintained public support through regimentation and propaganda. The North Vietnamese casualty rate was not necessarily driven by US actions, but North Vietnamese ones, as they generally dictated the frequency and intensity of combat. Their small-scale attritional attacks, combined with infrequent but ambitious offensives, were also partially designed to weaken US public will. North Vietnamese Commander-in-Chief Pho Nguyen Gia, who oversaw the victorious campaign against the French in 1954, understood that public will was a critical US strategic weakness, one which could be targeted via the battlefields of Vietnam. The war was fought on many fronts. At that time, the most important one was American public opinion. Westmoreland did not believe in human beings, he believed in numbers. He believed in weapons and material. Military power is not the decisive factor in war. Human beings are the decisive factor. South Vietnam also played a key role in the outcome. Despite significant US support, Thieu and his predecessors never seriously worked to develop state legitimacy or create a South Vietnamese identity. Its actions were undermined by the Viet Cong, but corruption, political favoritism, and elitism meant ARVN pacification efforts were ineffective at best and counterproductive at worst. Without a strong rural political base from which to develop the nation, South Vietnam was on shaky ground even with massive US military support. North Vietnamese political goals were proactive and clearly identifiable for the Vietnamese population. By contrast, the US's were vague and passive. By fighting to maintain the political status quo, the US locked itself into a commitment which would last as long as the North Vietnamese were willing to oppose that status quo. Although North Vietnamese morale began to suffer from 1968, it was much stronger than US public morale, precisely because the stakes of victory or defeat were higher and better understood. The Vietnam War remains one of the most controversial US military actions, and its legacy continues to impact US foreign policy. After the war, some claimed a so-called Vietnam syndrome would limit future US foreign interventions. A 1975 survey suggested only 36% of Americans believed the US should keep commitments to other nations. But by the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan reconceptualized the war as a noble cause to restore US confidence. The supposed end of the Cold War and US victories in Grenada, Haiti, Panama, and the Gulf War further diminished post-Vietnam caution. By 1991, President Bush Sr. was confident enough to announce, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all." The cause of the US defeat was complex and multifaceted and not the doing of any single group. Debates often also ignore effective and long-developed North Vietnamese strategy, which withstood an unprecedented military onslaught and may have continued to do so even if the US had acted differently. If there's one general historical lesson to be drawn from the American experience in Vietnam, it is that local history and culture set real limits on the effectiveness of external force, no matter how great that force may be. The United States had one failed war in Vietnam, and for a great and wise nation, one Vietnam War should be enough. But these lessons may have become muddied. The humiliation of the defeat has politicized the debate as supporters of one argument look to shift the blame to others, whether it's the military, Congress, media, or anti-war groups, or deny defeat altogether. By failing to come to terms with the reality of defeat, the possibility of making similar mistakes in the future is left wide open. Since you're watching this 2+ hour documentary about the Vietnam War, I'm guessing you might be a history buff interested in long-form history documentaries that cover all the crucial details. Well, we made 2 other epic World War II documentaries. The first one is 16 Days in Berlin, the most detailed documentary about the Battle of Berlin ever produced. A 4.5-hour day-by-day breakdown of one of the biggest battles of the entire war when the Red Army advanced from the Oder River into the heart of Nazi Germany's capital. Filmed on original location, featuring detailed maps and animations, expert interviews, and much more. The second documentary is Rhineland 45, about the last set-piece battle on the Western Front in which the Allies under Bernard Montgomery attacked from the Dutch border and ultimately crossed the mighty Rhine River. This 3.5-hour documentary was also filmed on original location and features detailed maps and animations, expert and veteran interviews, and more. But you can't watch 16 Days in Berlin or Rhineland 45 on YouTube because of our uncompromising portrayal of the war using authentic combat footage. So where can you watch these 2 massive documentaries with a combined runtime of over 8 hours? On Nebula, a streaming service we're building together with other creators, where we don't have to worry about YouTube's advertising guidelines and the mighty algorithm. If you sign up at nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you can watch all our content in 4K, ad-free, and earlier than on YouTube. And not just in your browser. Nebula is also available on your smartphone and devices like Apple TV or Roku. And all that for just $36 a year. And if you really want to support us and our production of long-form, highly detailed history documentaries, the Nebula Lifetime membership is available again for $300. Pay once and get Nebula for as long as both you and Nebula exist. The money of the Lifetime membership allows us to invest more time and resources into original series, and it supports us here at Real Time History directly. Again, that's nebula.tv/realtimehistory. Thanks for watching our Vietnam series. You can find links to the sources of all parts of this series in the video description below. And if you want to learn more about the Indochina War that preceded the Vietnam War, don't forget to check out our hour-long documentary on it. If you're watching this video on Patreon or Nebula, thank you so much for the support. We couldn't do it without you. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that's done running through the jungle. For now.